truly historically unprecedented. You know, there have been like demographic transformations by force, you know, whether you talk about like the Goths and the Roman Empire, things like that. But the idea of a country's elites just reaching out into radically different like cultures and bringing them in to overwhelm and displace the native people of the country that they're supposed to be ruling is insane. You know, thank goodness for Twitter, just for the fact that, like, if nothing else, you get to see those feelings put on display by people who are in like high positions, who never dare let that feeling leak, but they can't help themselves on Twitter.
Our guest today is Darryl Cooper. He's the host of the Martyr podcast and co-host of the Unraveling with Jocko Willink. His popularity exploded after he wrote a Twitter thread that landed him on the Tucker Carlson show and then was later quoted by Donald Trump. He is a master storyteller and focuses on exploring the complex stories of history to understand how people work. Enjoy.
So, surrounded by books, what do you think are there any historical time periods or events that remind you of what we're going through today that most closely resemble?
Well,
or bits and pieces of other.
I would say, like, I think it's not exactly that it reminds me of it, but like when you look back at the 60s and 70s, or like 55 through 75 kind of era, you can really see how we're sort of living the apotheosis of that time period now. So it's not like exactly that the dynamics are the same, but that like all the seeds that were planted there are all in full flower right now. And like that's, you know, maybe it was on my mind because I studied it for a while doing the Jim Jones stuff, but you know, I think that.
What are those seeds as you think of them?
What are they?
Yeah, what are they?
Well, I mean, if you look at what happened, right, in starting in say, really the 50s in most American cities, like if you go back to World War I, the demography of the country was pretty well established in the sense of like people kind of lived in their respective areas, whether that meant the respective part of a city, the respective part of the country, and people were kind of situated in World War I. And this was after, you know, really definitely 100 years, probably a little longer than that, of just constant churn from immigration. And things had started to settle into into something that, you know, had some demographic and geographical stability. And so we had like local cultures and communities starting to form again in different places. And when World War I happened, you've got millions of people overseas, you know, working age men overseas, limitations on what African Americans can do. And then in 1924, like shortly after the war, immigration from overseas largely being cut off, the cheap labor supply that like industry turned to was the African American pool, which was still, when World War I broke out, 95% still lived down in the South and mostly rural. And so when immigration from overseas, from Europe got cut off, it immediately got replaced with a mass migration of 6 or 7 million African Americans out of the South. And they're all moving, you know, from, again, the country South to the biggest cities in the country, right? And that's something that, whether you're talking about immigrant groups coming from the countryside in Ireland or in Europe, whether you're talking about like my ancestors on my father's side who were part of the Dust Bowl migration out to California, like you know, there's a culture shock involved there when you do that, and there's usually a bit of a clash, no matter who you're talking about. And so that starts to happen in all the northern and western cities, accelerates during World War II, and gets to a point where, you know, in 1950, 55 or so, the demographic transformation and the level of disorder in the cities is getting to the point where a lot of the white ethnics that were in those cities and had these sort of rooted communities, whether it was an Irish parish neighborhood or a Jewish neighborhood with, these, organic leadership structures that emerged, that were not imposed. They emerged from within the community and were sort of a representation of what was the natural hierarchy of the community, regardless of like whatever institutions were saying, they had these things in place. They had, informal ways of resolving disputes. They had local political systems in the cities set up in a way that the different ethnic groups sort of were able to get into a power sharing arrangement that worked for everybody. And things were, had existed that way for just really like a couple decades. And when you get up to about like the mid 50s, most of the cities kind of hit this tipping point where a lot of the white ethnics in those working class and lower class and middle class neighborhoods start to leave the cities and go out, in the post World War II suburb boom, and they move out. And so all of a sudden, instead of being, an Irish Catholic who lives in a parish neighborhood, who is surrounded by the people that you grew up with and people who watched you grow up and people you're going to know your whole life, with, maybe a parish priest or local big shot or whatever that everybody respects, and prominent families that like have some sway and sit in the front pew at church and all that kind of stuff, where you're in this sort of enclosed environment that, it sort of in some ways maybe limits your opportunities for self-expression, but it also gives you like a solid identity,
right?
Gives you a lot of just a certain solidity that, shortly after this period starts to dissolve. And so as those people start to move out into the suburbs, you don't have those communities anymore. Instead, you've got just like an Irish guy living next to an Italian guy living next to, whatever. And it's just people. And all of a sudden you start to see this transition from like people who previously identified with their religious faith, whether they were a Catholic or a Protestant or particular denomination, or they were Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic, they had their different churches and a real different sense of self-identity, in the way they organized and conceived of themselves. When they moved out, all those churches that they used to go to that were back in the old neighborhoods, it became all just old ladies who, were too old to like move out to the suburbs, and they stayed behind as the neighborhood went to hell. And it was just them. And then eventually a lot of those places closed, or they got taken over by, by somebody else, or eventually the place gentrified and it got kind of turned, but it wasn't what it was. It wasn't a neighborhood center, like a neighborhood church that, that really held the community together. Mm-hmm. And that was true of all of the, just neighborhood institutions, that used to sort of allow the people who lived in them to be self-governing, mm-hmm. And they moved out to the suburbs, and as the rootedness in those local communities that conferred a solid sense of identity on people went away, try as you might, like, it's really, really hard. I think people out there listening to this kind of know this themselves. Like, it's hard to like maintain yourself as like a Christian, say, just by yourself, totally alone. It's very difficult. Like, is it possible? Yeah. Pilgrim's Progress and all that, like, for sure. Like it is something you can do on your own. It's not designed to be done alone. No. That's the thing. It's like, and so what happens, with the individual is one thing. What happens in the aggregate is that it starts to lose its grip, and that idea starts to dissolve within people. And when, the idea becomes less important to your neighbor over here and less important to your neighbor over there, there's a good chance it's going to become less important in your life as well. And so all of those old things that used to confer, just to let a person know, all those things that they never really got a say in, that they didn't get to choose, which are really the things that define who we really are, or the things that we don't choose. As all those things sort of lost their grip, you have a bunch of sort of nameless, faceless people living in the suburbs without any real sense of neighborly community that they feel particularly rooted in. And, you know, you sort of start to see what we kind of have now. It's like you have a bunch of people who used to be Presbyterians, used to be Anglicans, used to be Catholics, and now they live in the suburbs and they're all white guys. Like that's pretty much like the only identity marker that is sort of in the, you know, in the sort of ether that they can sort of identify with and say, well, my neighbor over here and my neighbor over there, we have this in common. It's sort of the only thing that's out there. And so all those things kind of went away. And, you know, the society's become kind of hyper racialized in that sense. Mm. Now, partly that's because, you know, that's only one side of the story, obviously. The other side of the story is that, you know, after the immigration laws were changed in 1965 and, you know, the floodgates were open to the entire world, the third world primarily, you know, it could have gone several different ways, but the way that it did go, maybe partly because of the context, the Cold War context at the time, you know, there are a lot of different cultural factors, but what ended up happening was that, you know, the people who were coming in from the global South ended up getting integrated into the sort of black-white racial dynamic that had come to dominate America by that point. And it just, you know, black got expanded to people of color. And it became this, but the binary held, you know, and that was a binary that, you know, and people find this really tough to process sometimes because it seems so deeply rooted at this point. But you go back even to the 40s, and in the South, there was always a binary. Obviously, It was white, black. But in most of the rest of the country, there was not a binary. You know, you had like, you go to New York City in, you know, 1940, and you didn't have whites and blacks. You had Italians, Jews, Irish, Protestant Catholic. You know, you had just the different groups, and they all interacted with each other in a multipolar way. It wasn't like this binary thing. And, you know, the way that the South had always sort of had to approach things has sort of gotten exported to the rest of the country. It's become this binary, you know, the identity options that are sort of presented to people by major institutions and stuff are presented in a very binary way, to the point where
they're pretty, I mean, sort of literally superficial in some sense.
Well, they have to, you know, because the thing,
as opposed to like, oh, you know, I'm an Anglican, 25th generation Anglican, and my parish priest was my dad's and my grandpa's parish priest, you know, what?
Yeah, like
all that stuff to solve.
Identities that you can choose are always superficial. Mm-hmm. Like, and it doesn't matter how fervently like you believe it, it's always going to be sort of like worn on the surface to a degree. Like, and that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, you know? If you don't, like, if you're like somebody like me, like I just grew up as a like American mutt with no sort of background, you know, my people, I guess, have been here for a long time, but I don't really know because, you know, we didn't keep track of, you know, people like 2 or 3 generations back before my parents, you know, or anything. Just like, you know, I know that my dad's side came out with the Okies from the Dust Bowl. You know, my mom's side is just made up of people literally from like Ireland to the Balkans to Spain and like to Germany, just all over Europe, you know, that kind of crashed into each other here in America. And, you know, if you just think about like, well, how does within a couple generations, like somebody from Serbia, Ireland, England, Germany, Spain, and Norway, those are the ancestors on my mom's side going back a couple generations, like they all travel over here and like manage to find each other and marry off and like, you know, create a family. Part of the answer to that is like, well, for a lot of those people, like things obviously didn't go real well, because if they had, they'd be with their Norwegian community. They'd be with like, you know, whoever the people they came with. And so they were like sort of cast-offs, and they were kind of adrift. Like a lot of people, you know, people who go through like periods of tremendous change, like there's always going to be like cast-offs, people who don't like make it through without, you know, sort of fraying at the edges. And then those people find each other and like try to form some stability and solidity and get it going again. And so if you're coming from like a background like that, like most Americans are these days, that doesn't mean you shouldn't adopt an identity that seems meaningful to you. It's never going to be quite the same though as something that was bred into you from the time you were born. And you know, the people who were bred into an identity like that, very often what you find is they feel trapped by it, way too confined, you know, like, you know, like my wife has this big, huge extended family, and I have aunts and uncles, cousins, like, you know, grandparents. So like a 1 degree extended family. Them, I mean, it's like the whole clan, like for every imaginable holiday and birthday or whatever. And most of like her generation, they're like, another event. Jeez. Sure. And I just love it because I'm like, this is so cool. You guys don't know how awesome this is. And you know, that's sort of that's how we get you. That's how American culture gets you, you know, is like, it's kind of sort of the immigrant sort of, the difficulty that immigrants have to go through coming to America, you know, is watching your kids sort of pull away and become something that you don't recognize over time. And then your grandkids, and come to peace with that as they assimilate into a new culture. But yeah, so to circle back on your original question, because I can't help but do like the Putin thing, I guess, where, you know, I think that the big transition, like, you know, we went from this place where like you start off with America in 1800, right? And it's pretty much an Anglo country with a population of slaves in the South. There's like some Dutch, there's some this, that, or whatever sprinkled in, but really it's like an Anglo country with some black slaves in the South. But within a couple decades of the revolution, you know, most of the East Coast major cities are majority Irish, majority Catholic, not even Protestant anymore. You know, you have whole regions of the Northeast that are really like overtaken. When we say like today, Irish and English, we're like, same thing. It was not the same thing back then. You know, these were people who like were often at war with each other, and like did not see each other as being like close cousins by any means. And the people are coming over from Ireland, a lot of them in extreme turmoil because of the famine and just other, you know, things that were going on over there. Within a generation of the Irish getting settled, they're getting pushed aside by Eastern and Southern Europeans, you know, a lot of Italians, a lot of Jews, a lot of people from the Balkans and Poland who were coming in. And that's just sort of the American, you know, people on the right a lot of times balk at the idea that we're a nation of immigrants because they think that means therefore we should always let in maximum number of immigrants. But it's just a statement of fact, you know, that like we've always had this churn, this demographic churn. And what, you know, in other words, we have always been composed of a population that is in the midst of like turmoil and transition, you know, and going through like the most tremendous change really that we can really think of. You know, my great grandmother came here from Serbia when she was 7 years old with her 11-year-old brother. They were put on a boat and sent over here with directions in her brother's pocket for where to find a relative when they got to New York. Okay. I mean, like that's unimaginable today, right? I mean, it's just, we couldn't even like think of what the equivalent would be. And so like, this is like just generation after generation after generation of people, you know, who maybe that's kind of an extreme situation, but not by much, you know what I mean? And so that's like the American population for a long period of time. And, you know, when you get up to around sort of after World War I, you know, in the 20s, but really by the time you get up to World War II, you kind of have this thing starting to form up that is like, you can call really for the first time in like a long time, maybe since like 1800 going back, where you can look at it and say, this is the American people. You know, it's not like some recent group of people who are like working to assimilate and like they're still not quite there. And, you know, the immigration had been cut off for a while at that point. Pretty much everybody had been there for at least a generation. Most people have been there for 2. And, you know, most people had gotten there before World War I. So you're talking about 30 years ago. So people, you know, they're Americans now. You know, even if the older folks are still speaking Italian at home, their kids are all speaking English, right? Without an accent. And so you have this thing that you can kind of call the American people. The North and South have kind of, you know, World War II really kind of helped mend those fences. You know, you look at like a city like Vicksburg, after it was conquered in the Civil War, when the Civil War ended, Vicksburg didn't ever celebrate the 4th of July after that. And the first time that they did it was 4th of July, 1944, a month after D-Day. Because, I mean, it was just, you know, the end of the day, there were boys over there from the South and boys over there from the North who were fighting together. And, you know, it went a long way toward knitting us together in that way. So you had this period for like, maybe like 20 years or so where people were, like the 40s and 50s, you know, where people were still like knitted together into their organic communities, still had the sort of identity source that nourished them before when they were split off into like their different immigrant communities and so forth. But now it was all sort of built up into something that was recognizably American. And again, this is obviously, you know, this ended up being the fly in the ointment, the fact that there was a portion of the population that it did exclude, and that was Black people. And so that ended up being the sort of, you know, the Achilles heel of the whole project once the Cultural Revolution came around. But you had that like 20-year period or so that, like, you know, maybe it ended with Kennedy's assassination or whatever, wherever you want to like really, really put it, you know, where the vibe shifted, you know, sort of in an irreparable way. And, you know, you start to, you know, those people that the American people that you have there, maybe again for the first time in 150 years, you know, had only been glued together for maybe 20 years or something, and it was not a finished project yet. And when the 1960s came along, and, you know, whether it was because of, again, the move out to the suburbs, the Cultural Revolution, just all the different forces that kind of converged on them, it kind of pulled that fledgling, like, national identity project apart. And today we're sort of, you know, we're in this stage now where, you know, if you look back at, like, I always think about like Goldwater in '64. And I told somebody this the other day. They didn't know what I was talking about at first, but then they got it. As I said, Goldwater was to Nixon and Reagan as Sarah Palin was to Trump and Vance. It's like, you know, sort of the ripple at the beginning that, like, that there's something out there that's like going to be representative of this newly forming kind of political demography that's going to start asserting itself. You know, Goldwater's from Arizona. After this, you know, after World War II, when the Cold War kicks off, you have this massive expansion of Cold War industries in the Sun Belt, from Florida through Texas all the way to Southern California. And so you have like all these Cold War industry workers, a lot of tech and, you know, just Cold Warrior types, very evangelical, conservative people now in a place where, you know, they have some political power, and there are enough of them gathered to like start to cooperate in that sense. But also because of the Cold War industries, they've got money and they can actually assert themselves economically. And so that starts to happen. In '64, obviously, you know, nobody was going to beat Kennedy's successor. But, you know, Goldwater was there from Arizona. You get Nixon from Yorba Linda down in Southern California. You get Reagan from Southern California. And they very recognizably sort of, you know, are putting forth like a new sort of vision of what, like the American right at the time was supposed to be, right? It was like, because the American right was really set adrift after the New Deal won its total victory, you know, and it really wasn't until you got up to like the early 70s that really started to change. And, you know, that's sort of petered out though, I think. Obviously, like, you know, the Clintons, you can call them like, you know, moral abominations and all that kind of stuff. But man, they're like ruthlessly efficient and effective, in the sense that like the first thing Bill Clinton did when the Soviet Union went down and the Cold War was over is he like very selectively defunded all the Cold War industries in like Orange County and like all these specific places that were like strongholds of like Republicanism in the Sun Belt. Yep. And very selectively did it. And the Republicans didn't even know what was going on at the time. They just let it happen. But the peace dividend. It was like a political attack, but a brilliant one in a way. And so all those places evaporated, and sort of that moral majority kind of evangelical element of, like, you know, the conservative Republican Christian that was so prominent in the 90s, you know, it sort of lost its way, or lost its cohesion and its ability to sort of exert pressure on people other than themselves. You know, people kind of stopped listening. And so everybody was kind of waiting for something new to form up that was going to represent, I mean, half the people in the country who were not really being represented. And obviously we're in that stage now where those people are trying to find a voice. Some of them are really excited. Some of them are not too comfortable with the option that they've been given, but they're riding it because that's what's there. But it does represent like a real political earthquake. And you're seeing it play out very similarly to the ways that it played out in, like, with Nixon, for example, you know, where you have like sort of people think of the establishment as being like, you know, Chuck Schumer or something. Chuck Schumer is a representative for, you know, the establishment. This is a guy who goes out in front of a podium to represent the interests of the people who are behind him. And, you know, you have a bureaucratic administrative state that is 98% of the government. You know, the thing that you learned about on Schoolhouse Rock is not the government. I mean, it exists, but like that doesn't actually do any of the functions of government on a day-to-day or even like on a broader scale basis. And so you have this big machine that's back there that, like all machines, does what it's programmed to do. And what ours is programmed to do is, I mean, really, like if you think about, you know, if you go back to like to 1939 and look at the federal government, then compare it to the federal government now. And this is after like 6 years of New Deal programs expanding the federal government's purview and everything. In 1939, the federal government was like 95% smaller than it is now. And so it's about 95% smaller than it was in 1990. Okay. And so if you think about it like that,
1990.
Yeah.
Dang.
And so you think about it like that, and you realize that 95% of the government, virtually the entire government, has grown up in an environment and is built for the specific purpose of fighting global war. Like whether it's World War II or the Cold War, like that's what the government is purpose built to do, because it was the all-consuming mission of the government during those years. And it's to the, you know, even things that don't necessarily seem that way, like at first, right? If you look at the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, like all the stuff that was going on back then, that all had a massive Cold War angle. You know, you think like Eisenhower was just like, you know, so passionate about like, you know, Southern schools integrating that he was going to send the U.S. Army down there because, gosh darn it, it's just not fair. No, this is a major player on the world stage. Eisenhower knew what was going on, and he was looking at the situation of, you know, the Jim Crow South, and realizing that as we're making a play for the loyalty of the global South, the Soviet propaganda is just writing itself, and this is something we got to fix. And so we created a giant civil rights bureaucracy to fix that. And there was a major Cold War angle to it. Obviously, there are people involved who were not looking at it from that way. But like, I think would those people who were just concerned with the justice of the situation and all that have won such a total victory if they didn't have like the big, you know, the senior bondholders who were concerned with the Cold War, like on their side? Probably not, you know? And so everything is sort of built for that. And we kind of find ourselves in a world now where, you know, this is kind of changing again, but we find ourselves in a world where we have a massive state bureaucracy that's purpose built for global war without a credible enemy, you know, to turn it on. And, you know, obviously, I mean, the next sentence kind of is, everybody's already thinking it themselves. You go find one, you know, you go create one. And unfortunately, radical Islam didn't really prove up to the task. And so we're trying to find new ones now.
Yeah, Eric Prince wrote that article, and I am.
Too big to fail.
Yeah, too big to fail. But yeah, great. No, actually, it wasn't. I don't think it was that one. It was the Ben Braddock interview. So the one before, where he described, like he said, we used to fight wars of extinction. Now we fight wars of convenience. I think it's what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing, right? Because like if you go back to World War II, I think we called up like 16 million men. And this was, the population back then was what? It was like 160 million or something. I mean, it was so like, you're literally talking about like 25% of the male population, 40% of the military age male population that's put in uniform. And whether they went to war, like combat or not, like it's still, they were called up from their normal lives, put in uniform, and they went and did this, and then they came back. And so you get to 1950 and it's like, you can't throw a quarter on the street without hitting at least a relative of a veteran, right? Like everybody knows somebody who knows somebody at least who wore the uniform. And since then, I mean, like, and there's been like, people have done studies on this that like every generation that goes by, the military is becoming like a specialized caste where like you have somebody who's in the military and you say, do you know anybody in the military? And they're like, oh yeah, my dad, my grandpa, all my uncles, 2 of my cousins and such and such. And then you go to this person over here and say, do you know a single person in the military? No, I've never met one. And they're 2 totally different worlds. And so it's almost like a family business, in it's becoming a sort of caste in that sense. And so there's a big disconnect between, the war fighters, and especially nowadays. I mean, it's just because, we're past that point where, I guess there's a lot of reasons for this, but like, we're not fighting wars where we got to put 10 million men in the field anymore. I kind of doubt we probably will get to that point. Honestly, like everybody's kind of like wondering when the next like World War II will happen or something. I don't think there'll be another war like that for the next 1,000 years. I really don't. I think we might have a nuclear war, but in terms of just,
mass mobilization.
Yeah. When you say a war like that, what do you mean?
I mean that, where you have a bunch of states that for sustained periods of time organize themselves exclusively for the purpose of war and go at it with their resources and populations, like, as we did in like World War II. Because I mean, that's like, if you go back to like 1500, not even that, go back to like Louis XIV, right? Louis XIV, massively powerful monarch, the Sun King, like pretty much bankrupted his country, like just so he could like fight his wars and expand his power and splendor and all these things, like just the most glorious monarch of the time, right? And yet his ability to like reach down into a French village and like control the way people live their lives, or let alone what they thought or said or whatever, it was non-existent. I mean, he just didn't have the resources to do anything like that, because at the end of the day, the state was much, much, much smaller thing, and it could organize itself for war in certain instances. But even then, like, I mean, compared to what we started to see a little bit later on when the nation state formed, it's just totally different world. And when you start to see like, and me personally, like I'm sort of a technological determinist when it comes to this particular dynamic. I think as warfighting technology starts to change, political systems have to change with it. And, you get to a place where, the military technology dictates that you need to be able to put like 2 million men in the field. The nation state is the only thing really that's going to allow you to do something like that. And so when the nation state starts to form up and become, it was one of those things that like once it's started to form up in some places, everybody had to follow along because it was the only design at the time that could compete, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like only a nation state could put, 3 armies of 2 million men each, like on the Eastern Front or something. Only the nation state could field like fleets of bombers and battleships and so forth that you had to have if you were going to compete at the apex level, at that time. And, And so the nation state is sort of finding its way and knitting itself together. And you get up to like World War I. And I would say that was honestly probably like the real apex, but World War II, like, you know, we were a little more industrialized and so forth. But I mean, both of those wars, take them as a whole. And I mean, it's absolutely incredible just the level to which the countries that were involved were able to mobilize their whole society for war. I mean, every factory, every mine, just the entire economy, the society itself. You go back, like, you know, in World War I, England had like the women back home running around with white feathers, like to like shame the men who weren't going. So they were like enlisting them in a way, you know. The entire society was mobilized for war, something that was just never possible before, right? But the nation state had kind of reached its apex level of efficiency, like real, like high level efficiency. And when World War II gets over and we've got nuclear weapons, all of a sudden, we're in this very strange place where we have these gigantic institutions, the nation state, that are hyper efficient and just hyper militarized and ready for war, but none of whom can fight each other, right? And so you start to see this transition during the Cold War from open warfare to subversive warfare to information warfare. Kind of becomes the dominant form in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, not to downplay like the tragedy of things like Vietnam and Korea and all that, obviously, but those were sideshows for the Cold War belligerents. They weren't sideshows for the Koreans, obviously, but for, you know, the Soviet Union and the United States and NATO and the Warsaw Pact, like they were just theaters, you know, to play out these conflicts, to drain resources or win propaganda victories over the other side. Like that's really what they were for. And so, you know, you start to see this massive expansion of intelligence agencies and an expansion of their role in promulgating like propaganda and misinformation and all of these things that, you know, at the time you could kind of control because there's 3 networks and Walter Cronkite's kind of in on the deal and like, you know, kind of deal with that. But it's still, even back then, it started to confuse people, you know, and started to pollute the information environment in a way that that made it more difficult for people to you know, form strong ideas about what was really going on. And so, you know, I think that's another realm where, you know, we're sort of living out the apotheosis of that transition where, you know, information warfare has become, you know, it's not like it's the end all be all, because we see like in Ukraine right now, like at the end of the day, when all the propaganda has been put out and all the words have been spoken, sometimes you just got to fight. And so that still exists at like the bottom layer. But the general way that competition takes place between major institutions now, and the nation state still being the biggest, although it's on the decline, is information warfare.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, yeah, at the sort of underneath all of this, you still have people, right? People are the same. So like, I think we're seeing it. Something that I've been somewhat paying attention to is what's going on in England right now with the open protests. And so in the arc that you've described, you kind of, at least people seem to believe that we reached this apex, you know, the whole end of history. You get to, we're at a point where everybody can, regardless of where you come from, you can be smushed together into a peaceful, loving, harmonious society, regardless of background. We've sort of ended global war, and all that stuff, of course, doesn't go away. So, yeah, what do you make of something like what's going on in England? Sort of resurfacing in the midst of this apotheosis of liberal modernity, end of history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's you have to start with the fact that, again, to go back to like Louis XIV, you know, or just pick your whoever the most powerful English king was, they would never have dared to bring in a bunch of people from the southern hemisphere from 10,000 miles away and place them in like one of their peasant villages and just, you know, literally like make the people who were previously living in that town or village like a minority there. They would just never have dared to do that. Nobody would have.
And then said that by virtue of these people being the same location, they're English.
Well, right. Yeah. Then there's that. right. And so like, so just the sort of, we have to understand first, like the unprecedented nature of what's been going on. You know, the idea that like, you know, it's one thing if like, if you have a country, take like England or any of these European countries that are sort of facing this demographic change and the tension that comes with it, right? It would be one thing if like over the last 8 generations, just each generation of English people, English leaders and so forth, they were bringing people in from all over the empire and doing it in this way that like now it's led up to the point where London is majority non-English and pretty soon all of England is going to be majority non-English. You could look at that and say, well, look, the English people made that decision. You know, it's been going on for 8 generations. They have done this generation after generation, but that's not what happened in any of these places. Just like, you know, immigration's obviously a different thing here in America, but with the culture in general, just a lot of other things, it's one generation that just decided, you know, that we're going to do this. We don't care what anybody that came before us thinks or says. We don't care what anybody that comes after us thinks or says about it. We're just going to radically and irretrievably transform this country in a way that, I mean, if you just think about like, you know, the very idea of, especially in a democratic country, quote unquote, but still that's the idea. If you were to tell people that we're going to make a policy change that is going to make the descendants of all the people who live here right now a minority in this place in like 50 years or like 60 years, that's insane. I mean, that's an insane thing, right? And so for us in America, it's sort of like, again, like to go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, you know, we've always had this sort of demographic turmoil and churn. And it's like, it's not quite the same. Although, you know, obviously it's different when they're coming from non-Christian parts of the world and places that are very culturally different. You know, there's some of that still.
Yeah, but as a younger country, like certainly,
yeah,
a younger country that was started by folks leaving tensions in Europe.
Right. Like people think about like the 1798 Naturalization Act, and it says all free white persons of good character can become citizens of the United States. And you have a lot of people like on the dissident right and stuff who point to that and they're like, see, like white country or whatever. And it's like, dude, like, yeah, it does. Like it says that, sure. But like, it's literally the opposite spirit that, like, that thing was written.
What you think about it today.
Like right. It was like, you go back to 1798 and they're saying that any European can come over to the United States and become a full citizen in our democracy with full rights and privileges that go with that. It was like radically inclusionary, right? To a point where like nobody ever heard of anything like that before. It was crazy. And like they said white persons because they didn't want different states like gaming the system by like bringing their Native American and Black populations in as citizens, but not really giving them rights, but getting, you know, congressional seats for it or whatever. They didn't want that happening. So they put that in there. They weren't thinking like we have to exclude people from, you know, Zambia just for the simple reason that it was inconceivable that we would import a bunch of people from Zambia. It just never would have occurred to them. And so like, but it was radically inclusionary from the very beginning. And people on the right sometimes have trouble processing that. It wasn't just like, you know, like when the Irish came in, the WASPs who were here before were horrified what they were watching. I mean, they were absolutely horrified. You had these people coming in from like the country, you know, and it's like
they're Hicks, you know, in that way. Yeah.
From their own countries, they're Hicks. Yeah. And it's like, and again, like you go back to like when the Okies came out to California, dude, everybody hated them. Like there were like a bunch of like, you know, poor Southern agricultural like migrant workers who would come out living in tent cities outside of Salinas or, you know, Sacramento. And just the tent cities were chaos, drunks, you know, a lot of just filthy, people would wander out and go rob your house sometimes, and I'm not like casting shade. These are my people on one side of my family, but but they hated them, and the same when like a lot of the hillbillies went up to the Midwestern cities like Detroit and stuff. They had a huge like backlash against them. So that's just normal and natural. And, the people today who think like that, when, you watch Gangs of New York or something like that, that's just sort of like a, that was real conflict. I mean, they weren't just fighting in the streets because like, we're violent gangs and we want to fight you or whatever. They thought their country was being destroyed by these Irish people. That's what they thought. And then when you got up to the late,
white, that's the point right here. Like,
yeah. And then you get up to like the late 1800s, it was the same thing. You had like Italians getting lynched. You had like people thought that the Jews and the Italians and the new people that were coming in were destroying the country. Like that's what they thought and that's what they wrote. And yeah, there were Christians, they were Europeans and all that. But at the time, people saw them as radically foreign and incredibly destructive to like what we'd built, right? And so in that sense, like what we're going through now is maybe I'll buy the idea that it's like a sort of a starker and more extreme version of it when you're dealing with non-Christians and when you have like the sort of post 1960s racial binary that everybody's kind of broken into. I'll buy that. But still here in America, like we've always just been subject to that. It's just every single generation is like, demographic war with the newcomers. And then a generation later, those newcomers are part of the native population and they join the war against the next wave. I mean, that is just how it's been. Over in Europe, it's like all these countries, like you go back to like 1980 and it's like 95% English people in England. Like if not more than that, you go to Norway or Sweden, any of these places, it's like 98% Swedish people, not just white people, Swedish people, right? And so these changes that are coming on them are happening incredibly quickly. They're changing something that's been the same for centuries, where you actually have like a rooted national community with like a sense of having formed itself out of the, out of the churning kind of chaos sea of Europe over the years, and they're watching this being taken away from them in one generation by policy choice. This is not like, if you live in, if you're from Spain and people just, the boats are coming Camp of the Saints style, like across Gibraltar, and they're just sort of coming in and like, you could look at that as like, all right, that's the Goths coming in. That's the, like all these migrant invasions throughout history that like, you just kind of got to deal with. Most of these European countries, this is a policy choice. It's an ideologically driven policy choice. And they're again, to go back to like the real, the only reason it doesn't sound completely insane to people today is just because, we're kind of used to it at this point. But like the idea that like English people are currently on track to become a minority in England within like a couple decades is insane. I mean, it's completely insane, and I put this tweet out like kind of tongue in cheek, I guess. I don't know. Probably not, I guess. Like a lot of times I put things out tongue in cheek and then I think about it. I'm like, no, I guess I was in earnest. Whereas like my default, and I'm not saying you should go like burn down a Pakistani store or something. Obviously, if you do that, you're just you're a hood. Like regardless of what the cause is, like you're just a hoodlum and you're that's a different question to me. But at the end of the day, like my bias is if I'm watching a video and there's a bunch of English people saying England for the English, and they're in London, and across the street, there's a bunch of people saying Allahu Akbar, I think that the English are the good guys. And I don't really need to know much else about it. And if I see a video, in Riyadh, and it's a bunch of like Saudi, Arabs on one side of the street saying Arabia for the Arabians, and a bunch of British dudes on the other side of the street saying, bring the cross or whatever, I'd be like, I think maybe the Saudis probably are winning this round, in the sense of like, that's just my bias. I mean, it just seems like, again, like one of the things I think that people can always benefit from is you know, try to step back and like there are so many things, something like this, that if you just step back like a little bit from it, you realize is completely insane. And it's only not insane if like you're, you know, just like if you've been reading the Harry Potter books and you're in like the middle of the 5th book and you're reading it right now and you're into it. And it's like magic doesn't seem so insane because this is the world you're in and it's kind of like what you're sucked into and da 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 da. And then you put the book down and it's like, oh, it's, you know, that's the only like domain in which it's not insane is these books I have right here. But we're sort of sucked into that all the time through the media environment and everything, to the point where, you know, a lot of this stuff has been normalized that is truly historically unprecedented. You know, there have been like demographic transformations by force, you know, that whether you talk about like the Goths and the Roman Empire and things like that. But the idea of a country's elites just reaching out into radically different like cultures and bring them in to overwhelm and displace the native people of the country that they're supposed to be ruling is insane. And this will probably, I don't want to, you guys can edit this out if you want, I guess, if you want this to be able to be played in England without getting arrested next time you go there. But if something like that is happening, I mean, the people, you can edit this out if you want. The people are 100% morally, politically, whatever angle you want to talk about it from, they are justified in reacting violently to that. I mean, they're losing their homes. They're having their homes taken from them. Again, like, you know, by government policy, which means by violence. You know, I'll get all libertarian and gay here, but like all government policy is backed by violence at the end of it, as we're seeing right now. Like the people who are objecting to this, you know, even online, are getting thrown in jail.
If you pray silently.
I saw that video. It was insane.
That's unbelievable.
It's totally insane. And it's like, you know, okay, well, you can say like, well, that's not, you know, there's nothing violent that happened. Be like, well, okay, what if they didn't consent to being arrested? What if they said, I haven't done anything wrong, I'm not going with you? Well, yes, you are. Well, no, I'm not. Well, they're going to get as violent as they have to with you in order to make you comply. And if that means like you really want to push it, they'll kill you. That's what it means. Again, that's my end of gay libertarian, man. But like, you know, it is backed by violence like that. So you could say by violence, these people are being displaced from their homes. And, you know, and being done by a very narrow, like, socioeconomic and ideological class of people who know that the people they're doing this to do not want it. And they've known it for decades and they're doing it anyway. And for a lot of them, they're doing it with malice in their hearts. They're doing it because those people deserve it in their eyes. You know, and something you've seen here in America too. Like, you know, I did one of my series where one of my episodes where I talked a lot about John Lindsay, the mayor of New York back in the late 60s, early 70s. So I look at as like he's the guy who the term limousine liberal was invented for. He was a Republican. He eventually switched over, but like he was like a, you know, he wasn't even like, he didn't grow up super elite. It was kind of like middle to upper middle class, but he became an elite WASP, and just the emblematic elite WASP, right? Like of the East Coast establishment. He looked the part. He just, everything absorbed into him, like that idea. And he looked on like the ethnics in Queens and, you know, Brooklyn, and these people who were protesting against like the changes in their neighborhoods, you know, that were taking place as like the blacks and the Puerto Ricans were coming in and changing things. He just looked at those people as, you know, all right, we had to deal with the Confederacy. We had to deal with the Germans in World War II. And now we got to deal with you people like that, you know, just this, you know, just this pervasive moral evil that this pervasive moral stain that the people like John Lindsay and the whole class of people that he identifies with, the class of people who've been ruling all Western countries, you know, in the post-war era, who derive their sense of self-identity from the fact that we are better than those people, and those people are bad and we're not like them. And that drives, I mean, you see it a lot on, you know, thank goodness for Twitter, just for the fact that, like, if nothing else, you get to see those feelings put on display by people who are in like high positions who, you know, if the only way we heard them before was, you know, a 5-minute spot on cable TV, they would never dare let that feeling leak, but they can't help themselves on Twitter because we're all just impulsive, ridiculous creatures on Twitter. And so you see it like, and you're like, oh, wow. Like this editorial writer for the New York Times, like actually hates my guts. Like they actually like really hate me. And like they hate my family. And it's like, wow, that's crazy. And then you realize that, you know, when you see that often enough and you see it as concentrated as it is in like a certain class of people and the people who aspire to that class, and that those are the people who have been running our societies for, you know, really since the end of the Second World War, a lot of this stuff is being done with not just carelessness, but with malice. And so when, you know, the people in England, you know, it's tough, right? Because here's the thing. And I tell this to people, Charles and I talk, we argue about this all the time. He thinks the revolution's coming, baby, like one of these days. And I always tell him like, he's the best. And I hope it does happen. If it does, then, you know, I'll consent to being one of his lieutenants and accept his command. Yeah. I'll you know, I'll kneel and accept my place in the lower officer tier. And, but, you know, I always tell them like, you know, you don't have an uprising like that, in a society that is just completely socially disorganized the way ours is. It's like, okay, what movement are you going to go join? Like, you don't even know your neighbor's first name. And so you don't have anybody around that you really trust, you know, that is this person going to be okay with being given a 20-year sentence and not turning me in for like being, you know, involved with this or something. Like, do I trust them that much? You don't know anybody like that. You don't have a single person in your life, most likely, that you feel that way about. Maybe like a couple of family members, but that's it. And so the idea that you have like whole communities of people that could be organized for resistance, like it's just not in the cards. Like you have to build that social capital before anything remotely
over generations.
Yes. And you know, the ironic thing about it is you could say that like that's the only way that like real resistance, especially violent resistance to the regime, would be possible. But the thing is, if you did build that over generations, violent resistance would be unnecessary. You know, that's really the thing. And like, and so the people in England, like I look over there and I'm like, you know, I sympathize with these people who, you know, again, it's different from being an American, you know. Yeah. In American, like you can love your country, you can, like, we feel all these things like emotions, national emotions, just like everybody else. But man, I just think it's just not quite the same as like an Englishman watching England be turned over to people from South Asia. It's just not the same. And like, I sympathize with them 100%. I won't say like I said earlier, like, you know, the guy who goes and like burns down a Pakistani store, like that's just a shitty guy, like a bad guy that we should all condemn. And I won't take that back. But at the same time, like, I don't even want to say that about him. Because these people are in a position of extreme desperation where their ancestral homeland is going to be permanently taken from them. That's like the worst thing that can happen. Right. You know what I mean? That's not like something that's like, you know, we lost this war or we had an economic collapse or whatever. It's the worst thing that can happen is you have a people, the English people, who are no longer going to have like a little spot of the earth that they can develop and work out their own community, culture, and ideas. Like they're just not going to have that anymore. And it's the worst thing that can happen. And if those people, you know, anything that they feel they need to do in order to stop that process from happening, I'm not prone to criticize them. I'm just not, you know, and, there are ways that I think are better and worse. And I think like on an individual level, you know, if you're an English dude out protesting, you know, and you're my friend and you're like, let's go beat up that Pakistani, whatever, and be like, no, you're not going to do that. Like, that's bad. But in terms of like watching in the aggregate, like the way people are responding to this crisis, I'm just not really prone to criticize however they feel they need to, approach that. I mean, because it really, I mean, again, like, it's just the gravity of what's going on. And the thing is people would get it. They do get it when we're talking about Palestine. Yeah, that's the thing. Like everybody, all the people who are just so aghast, like, or at least half the people who are so aghast at what the English people are doing, they look over, they'll justify Hamas, some of them, but all of them justify like the sort of rock throwing, like, resistance in the West Bank and stuff, because people look at that and they're like, these people are having their home taken from them. Like, what are they supposed to do? Just watch it happen. And so people do get it in other contexts. If people like, if all of a sudden the Chinese government made just a policy change and started importing people from Africa and other parts of the world into these places so that Beijing and these other major cities and eventually the whole country, Han Chinese, were going to be a minority in 50 years, we'd be like, holy shit, they've lost their minds. Like, this is insane. The leadership class over there has lost its mind. And is like, their people there are under attack by their leadership class. Like, that's the way we would see it, because that's the only way to see it. But here we're in the middle of it. And in the West, we're all traumatized by what we think happened in World War II. And we're traumatized by what we think and are told, the history of colonialism was all about and all these kind of things. And plus, we're just Christians and we're nice people. And we don't want to be mean and rude to other people. We want to be open, welcoming, and accepting. And so, we are very uncomfortable pushing back on any of this stuff. Even rhetorically, people are uncomfortable with it.
I was just saying real quick on that topic. How did the English go from, I was just reading Around the World in 80 Days, again, childhood favorite, but English guys in a pub in England, not a pub, but, club, saying, hey, I bet I could go around the world in 80 days. Mm-hmm. We own most of the world. It'll be great. Like, very robust English to 100 years later, self-immolating, bringing in immigrants. You see the video of the English policeman with the Muslims behind him. Looked like a hostage situation of him saying, Assalamu alaikum, we love the Muslims. Yeah. And like, how do you go from that to that in 100 years?
I mean, there's a lot of factors involved. First of all,
great.
Part of it is this, like, one of the things that happened if you go back to World War I, right? There were a lot of the countries on that Entente side in Europe putting forth all this propaganda to motivate their people about how, we need to save freedom, save the free world from, this authoritarian, violent German state and so forth. And, we need to make the world safe for democracy. It's all about national self-determination. These Germans are trying to take people's self-determination away from them and so forth and so on. And people bought into it, and they went and they fought the war, and they won World War I. And then the war ended, and all that propaganda went away, but the ideas didn't go away. Those were too firmly planted in people's heads. And so all of a sudden they're like, wait, national self-determination. Well, that's what the people here in this colony of ours are asking for. So maybe I'm not so comfortable with that anymore. And, those are the cracks in the foundation that eventually like kind of brought that down. And so so when you get into the Cold War, World War II and the Cold War, you just have like decades of this, of like propaganda that is really like the real purpose of it was to say, the Soviets, who are telling all these post-colonial countries and the global South in general and all these uncommitted countries around the world that, you got to think about this, right? From the perspective of the people at the time and just how easy the Soviet propagandist job was, right? Like we, the Americans and British and so forth, we're allied to all of the old colonial countries, right? So all of you in the global South who, are really like mad at the British, the French, no matter who it is, the Portuguese, the Dutch, whoever it is, the Americans are allied to them. And that's one side of it, right? And so World War II ends, we're here. We want to liberate you from these people. You have a national liberation movement? Fantastic. Here's all the money and guns we can send you and everything. That's what we're about. What do the Americans do? Why, no sooner did the Vietnamese like free themselves from the French boot until the Americans showed up to try to like put it back down on their neck. And like that propaganda, again, just writes itself. Mm-hmm. And so a huge amount of like the propaganda we were putting out and eventually the policies that we took up, I mean, a lot of like the impetus, we kind of talked about this earlier, but like really like a lot of the impetus for ending Jim Crow in the South was like the people who were in the major power positions and like decision-making positions for the Cold War were like, we cannot have this. Like we cannot like go over to, Ghana and tell them why they should be on our side when half of our country is still in like basically an apartheid state. We're getting killed out here. And so, a lot of it was like, again, similar to the World War I propaganda, was sort of driven by world events and became real, in a way. It became like the way people thought about things. And it was something that was really like meant as weaponized propaganda to help us in that conflict, but it became real. And now people could ask, why did it take root so easily? And that could have a lot of answers, I mean, because it's not just, this is one factor that I'm talking about. There's a lot of people that are going to want to say that it started with the Enlightenment. It's liberalism, it's Christianity, even.
Protestant Reformation, right?
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, like all of those, you can, if you're clever enough, you can argue all those points probably pretty effectively, Like I saw somebody on X the other day who I follow, who somebody had said like, it's one of these dorky like liberal evangelical preacher types, just intolerable, people that make you want to pull your hair out. And they go online to be the Pharisee, like pounding his chest and thanking the Lord that he's not like this tax collector over here. And he's saying, you cannot be a Christian and a racist. And the guy that I was following posted that, and he's like, he says some like flippant comment about, slavery being okay in the Bible or whatever as a way to saying, yes, you can, essentially, or that's not a good point. But I mean, look, that is a totally valid point in the raw sense. Yeah, you can't. Like, there's a reason that the very first convert to Christianity in the book of Acts was an Ethiopian eunuch. Yeah. They didn't just like pick that randomly. Like there's a hard message in there that like, the foreigner, even the most degraded and radical foreigner, which to them at the time would have been like a Cushite, and a eunuch. So somebody that you have no respect for as a man who's from a culture that's radically different than yours, that's your brother. Like that's one of the first messages like that takes place after the crucifixions, like one of the first things that happens. And it gets the whole ball rolling, and you can't get away from that. The fact is one of the things, I got into a debate with, first Lafayette Lee and I had a conversation that we took down as a dialogue in I'm 1776 about American identity and heritage and so forth. And there were a couple of people, Scott Greer was one of them, who thought that we just sort of had evaded the idea of talking about race, right? And the importance of like, whiteness in the history of America and stuff. And Lee and I, we weren't evading it. We just, we were talking about what we thought mattered, but we were like, all right, let's bring these guys in. We'll do a follow-up and they can make their case and we'll make ours. One of the things I kept coming back to, I don't even remember if I actually got to this in the dialogue because the other two guys like took up like 9 out of 11 pages. And so I just like eventually let them hold the floor. But, the thing I told them afterwards when we were discussing it is I was like, dude, if you think that you're going to get a random white guy over here sitting in a church pew to turn on the darker skinned person sitting in the pew next to them because of some racial identity that, you've concocted and think is important that is never going to happen. That is never going to happen. That guy, if he's any kind of Christian whatsoever, is never going to turn on that guy for you, ever. And so there is something to that, the Christian idea that makes it so that it is more difficult for a Christian. And I don't mean more difficult, I don't mean that it's more difficult, like in terms of like ground truth, like to reconcile with ground truth, but more difficult, like in your heart, in your mind. It's harder for a Christian to tell somebody, no, you can't come in, or to exclude somebody. It's just harder because, I mean, it's, love your neighbor, fine. Love your enemy. Nobody says that except for, I mean, it's an insane idea to like anybody who's not a Christian,
Sure.
Even a Jew. You tell a Jew, love your enemy, you think you're totally insane.
Rise and kill first.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, to take that, I mean, that's the hardest saying in all religious literature, as far as I'm concerned. Like, just the demand that it makes on you is really like, people will like look at the passage where, the rich man comes to Jesus and wants to follow him, become a disciple. And he says, okay, sell everything you have and give it away to the poor and then follow me. And he says, he's not happy about that, because he's a very rich man, but okay, I'm going to do that. It's like, just let me go bury my father. And he's like, no, come on right now. We're leaving. And people see that a lot of times. I mean, I read that and I'm like, damn, like, if that's what's required, like to be a Christian, then I think we're all in a lot of trouble. I don't think that's what the passage is saying. I think that's what was required to be a disciple, in those times specifically. But in a way, when you're called on to love your enemy, like that is a total claim. I mean, it is a claim that like requires that you give up give up control over something that is like so deep and fundamental to like, just your will. You're turning over like such a deep part of your will if you're going to follow that command. It's a total person command, like it requires you to become a different kind of human being in order to be able to do that. And so Christians, we don't always do that. In fact, most of us rarely do. And, even when we think we're doing it, we're probably not doing it so well. But we strive toward that, at least in our hearts and minds. And it makes it very difficult, even when you tell people like, okay, so put yourself, like we're sitting here in this room with this table, you've got an empty room. You're sitting on one side of the table. On the other side of the table is a family. And they're telling you their story of how they got here and how terrible things are back in the old country and how their lives are in danger and they're so poor and all these things. Can we please like find a place in your country to live? Well, only an incredibly heartless person could tell them no, right? But then you say, okay, then what happens is you let them in and then the door opens and another family comes in. And then you look outside and you realize there's 60 million people lined up outside that door, and it's growing all the time because I think that's what they say is like 60 or 65 million displaced persons in the world, like just displaced persons. Forget about like immigrants and stuff. And so how does that change your calculus? Now you look at this family and they become, in a way, like it gives you the moral strength to probably make the necessary decision. But to do that, you kind of have to dehumanize this family that's standing across the table from you. There's just no way around it because you can't tell that family no and look at them as a family with kids right there, and still think of yourself as fully human, if you do that. And so it's very difficult to bring yourself around to a place where you can make a decision like that without really hardening your heart in a way that, that we're called on as Christians not to do. And I think that's one of the reasons too, like when you look at a lot of the people who do concern themselves, like on the right, like white people who concern themselves with racial identity and racial issues. One of the questions like I always have about these folks, or I used to have, I think I've got it pretty well figured out now, is like, why can't you guys just be like, Europeans are freaking awesome. And like, classical music's great. And we all love like, so like, why is like every one of your websites, every one of like your conversations, it is just all vitriol and hate toward all the other people? Why does it always turn into that? Like, I didn't quite get it. But I think part of it is that, it kind of has to do with what I was just talking about. Like in a way, in order to be able to assert certain things, like people have to overcompensate almost and like hate those people in order to be able to do it and to think that way and feel good about themselves, because if like that person is another human being just like you, let alone if it's another Christian, you're called on to treat as like a literal brother. It becomes just incredibly hard to exclude that person from anything. And yet you have to do that. And some people, kind of overcome that cognitive dissonance, I think, by just really radically dehumanizing, the person. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, the whole thing's a mess. I think partly it's, to take your example, the family, and then back to something you said earlier, a lot of this stuff, especially in England, happening over one generation, the demographic replacement. It's really different if you have massive war in a particular part of the world. Thousands upon 10,000s of families moving to England, and the English, not the ruling administrative state of England, but the English, qua English, opening their doors to these individuals,
like the
Christians,
Huguenots,
like guests, right? Like the Huguenots, exactly right. And like guests, and that's, I think, fundamentally, like in many ways, that the immigrant is the foreigner. There's rules in Deuteronomy where there's ways to treat them humanely, obviously, first of all, but there's a very much of a house guest sort of dynamic. You're a guest in my home, you're a guest in my country, and then you respect me. And but there's that like benevolent dynamic where the people open the door to a family that's in need and you let them in. And that's unfortunately, that's not the setup that the English have been given.
Yeah.
The setup is take a box and you just flip it around and dumps many, many people who in the mix are families that do need that could use that kind of help. But a lot of it is just people who literally don't want that, who want to pillage and destroy your country and take it from you, and are glad that your administrative state is like Esau selling your birthright on your behalf, and not even on your behalf, without you knowing or agreeing to it.
Yeah.
And that they get to walk away with it.
Yeah. And it, and obviously it just adds, massive jet fuel to the fire. The fact that the people who come into the country are immediately sucked up into a political and ideological system that exists that weaponizes them against the native population. I mean, that's really
right away.
Like I knew somebody, close friend who was a principal of a school down in Orange County, like Santa Ana. So very like 85% Latino, a lot of immigrants, a lot of first generation. And, and she said that there'd be this dynamic, people like to point out, like they'll say that like immigrants have a lower crime rate than like native born Americans. Fine. I can actually buy that. Most of the immigrants that I would see and that I knew, they were working out in the fields over here and so forth. Right. Tell me about the second generation. What's the second generation doing? And she said, the principal, she said, she'd have these parents who would come to her, these are Catholics, from Mexico or somewhere in Central America, Catholic people who the dad is working 2 jobs. The mom is, working full time as, cleaning houses, whatever. They're like struggling to make things work, but they're doing it and they care about their kids, and they would come to her, be like, I don't know what's happening to my kid. Like, cause he comes over here and, he gets sucked up into gangbanger culture, or just gets sucked up into this like, culture that's sort of hostile to the rest of the, the country, whether it's like on along ethnic lines or whatever it is. And they would come to her and say like, what do I do? Like, why is this happening? And what she couldn't tell them, obviously, is that like, oh, that's us. We're doing that. Right. That's actually why we exist, is to weaponize your kid like that, And like, and so that makes it even more difficult. It's like, even if, you had a situation where people were being welcomed, in a merciful way, that can't last if you have a faction, especially a dominant power faction in the West right now, that is intent on using those people, as instruments of their own power. Yeah. And, you talk about like the English ruling class, like doing this, like the really wild thing about it is like, yeah, they're nominally English, but really like it's a multinational Western ruling class that's doing it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody kind of knows that. It's like, yeah, you keep people who like were from England over there and they keep people who are German over there. But really it's like this, you know, multinational class of people who are imposing these uniform policies on everybody. And they get to the point where somebody like Viktor Orban, who's like, you know, okay, you don't have to agree with all of his policies. You don't have to think he's not liberal enough or whatever it all is, but he's like a radically popular, democratically elected president of a country that respects the civil rights of all of its citizens and does all of the baseline things that we expect of like a, you know, of one of our guys, you know.
He's just like this wicked, vicious.
Yeah. And they would destroy him in a second if they could, you know, and if honestly, like if they thought they could get away with it, they would color revolution his ass in a minute. Mm-hmm. And it's like, then you kind of, so you think about that and then you kind of think like, well, what's really the game they're playing here? Like, what is, like, why is it that, that like the marching forward of the sexual revolution and the demographic displacement of native populations in our countries, that those are the two things that are not up for debate, period. You can debate everything else. You want to be capitalist or communist? Like we'll figure out how to make ourselves comfortable either way. So you guys argue. What do you want to do with abortion? You guys can argue about whatever it is. You guys can argue about this stuff all you want. But like there's like these two domains that just they're not subject to the democratic process. Like you can see it in England now. I mean, in England, like, you know, granted, like people will be like, oh, well, yeah, technically they don't have a First Amendment. So it's actually okay if you arrest that woman for praying silently on the streets. It's like, what, then cut them off. If they're arresting a woman for praying silently on a street corner, that should not be our ally. Like if that's like what they want to do, then cut their asses off or go invade them and freaking liberate the English people from these, you know, from these people who are controlling. Because, I mean, again, like it's like when you think about like how insane and just how unprecedented it is for a single generation of a ruling class to decide that it is going to make the native population of its country, that in its ancient homeland, right? Again, not like America, and I don't want to downplay the experience here. There's a lot of
different lay of the land.
Talking about their ancient homeland.
Right.
I mean, look at like Ireland. Those people the Irish have been in Ireland for thousands and thousands of years, right? And like you have these people, one generation of elites decides to take that away from them for all time, you know? And when the people push back a little bit, I mean, they're arresting them for posting about it on Twitter, you know? I mean, like it is not up for debate.
In group chats.
In group chats. Yeah. So it's like, it is not up for debate. If you question it, and that is the one thing, you know, they're not going to arrest you for going on and saying our National Health Service sucks or our abortion policy is bad or whatever. They're not going to arrest you for that stuff. But this one is non-negotiable. And you look at it, you're like, what? I guarantee you, like, I mean, you kind of see this sometimes when like in some of the interviews with Putin, where he talks about some of the stuff that's going on in the West. He's like, they really feel like we've lost our minds.
Baffled. No, he's
like, why are they doing this to themselves? Like, I don't get it. And you know that like Xi and all the Chinese and just everybody else around the world, like they look at it and they're like, what are they doing? Like, why would they do this?
Right. However, you might disagree with them and particularly Xi, like truly a communist dictator. But like even they wouldn't inflict these kinds of insane, like, it just literally doesn't make sense. This 2 + 2 + 5 level of logic. Have you read Raymond Ibrahim, Defenders of the West, or Sword and Scimitar?
I've got Sword and Scimitar up here somewhere, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
But no.
Yeah, so you should. They're awesome books. But that's the other thing that I just read Sword and Scimitar and moving on to Defenders of the West. And again, the US doesn't have this kind of history with the players in the game right now, where to tell, you know, we used to have Christendom, then post-war consensus replaces Christendom with NATO functionally. And to tell the inheritors of Christendom, even in the modern form of it, that the 14 centuries of battle where you used to have, and it's really amazing reading this book. It's like, realized I didn't realize, grew up in a Christian home, but I didn't realize how the world really was shaped in this way, where you had individual, independent, in many ways, like, ethnically different with their own customs and languages, all these different states, and they would band together, in many ways put aside their differences when the Muslim threat would come over and over and over and over again over 14 centuries. You tell those folks that their descendants a few generations later, like, would just be like, we give up.
Yeah.
Without a fight.
Yeah. Like Corleone says, like, you give in to a nation that won you without blows. Just full on, like, and not just, it's not really even give up. It's, you're evil if you don't want this to happen.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. And you'll be told that by people who put their kids in private school when there's too many immigrants in the public school.
Right.
And they're the ones telling
luxury belief sort of.
Yeah. And you're still supposed to take them seriously. And, like, it's a high status sort of perspective to agree with them. It's insane. I mean, yeah, like I think about, like, like a sort of somewhat more recent example is just look at the Irish. Just centuries of brutal resistance to the British trying to absorb that island and get these people to just be Brits, and just stop this whole
stop resisting.
Centuries and centuries of, like, refusing to back down. And and I mean, you can talk about Cromwell, or you can talk about, like, there's a lot of events that, like, incredible brutality. I mean, the British did not mess around when, like, they were trying to, like, but when they were in their heyday and they wanted to accomplish something and you were resisting. We have a bad, like, a sort of muddled view of this as Americans because they took it easy on us. But, like, they didn't take it so easy on other people, and they never took it easy on the Irish. And for centuries, they were arrested. They were killed in battle. They were, killed in their homes. Their homes were, it was brutal oppression for centuries. And they held out. And then, like, literally a few decades of liberalism, and they're giving their country away. I mean, the Irish are on track to be a minority in Ireland, like, by the end of the century. That is, it's just, you couldn't even, like, go tell Michael Collins that happened, and he'd be like, oh, the British won, huh? No, you actually won. But, and I mean, it's like, it comes back a little bit to what we were trying to figure out earlier, when I was talking about, like, the propaganda angle of it. Because, I mean, there really is, like, an angle too where, I struggle with this sometimes, like, because I don't know which part to place emphasis on necessarily. Is, sure, like, there's liberalism for sure. And you can say a few decades of liberalism did what centuries of British brutality couldn't. And that's true, but liberalism's been around for quite a while at this point. Even in Ireland, it's been around for quite a while. Even if it hadn't reached out into the countryside, like, until a little more recently, it's been around a while in, like, the decision-making centers. But I do wonder, like, how much technology, like media technology, really is, like, the almost like the dominant factor in this, that, like, people now are sort of so absorbed into the media environment. It's become so all encompassing for them that, like, even if you're not actively on your phone or watching the TV, that's still the world you're really living and thinking in. It's sort of defining everything for you as you're going around. And so, it's a very, very narrow range of, like, a very, very narrow range of people demographically, socially, economically, ideologically. It's basically like a bunch of people filtered through a few universities that all select for ideology, and these are the people who, for a long time anyway, obviously, like, we're part of the reason we're starting to fray a little bit and come apart is that the internet is breaking up this monopoly. But for a long time, that dream world that people were kind of sucked up into, the mass media. I mean, we have trouble like thinking about this today, but you go back to like the late 50s before they had the big scandal with the quiz shows when they found out that the quiz shows were rigged, right? You would have 2/3 of the American population on their couches at the same time watching a broadcast of like the most popular quiz shows at the time. Like, I mean, what that means, and it would be the same the next night. There's like Western.
The Holy Roman Empire at its apex couldn't even have imagined such a like liturgy. That's that kind of scale.
That's exactly
where you have just everybody bowing down before the altar of media.
And what's the point? Like, what is the function like of a liturgy with regard to the congregation, right?
To catechize.
It's to catechize, but it's also in order to prepare them to be catechized. You know, that's the point of the vestments and the building and the music and the incense and all the things, is to bring these people, which you couldn't probably do like unless you had them as a group, you know, to bring them all into a sort of emotional resonance that caused them to sort of voluntarily open themselves to be catechized, right? And so you had this dynamic where vast swaths of the country, I mean, like, again, like 2/3 of the country are all getting together every night and sort of following the same emotional up and down and like on this same like sort of level of resonance, right? And you go in the next day and like everybody watched the show last night and they're all feeling the same way you felt about it. Everybody saw it. And that's, you know, what you're talking about. And like, and so, you know, like, I mean, for us today, you know, it's like when I grew up, I didn't really start using the internet like on a regular basis until I was in my early 20s. Like, maybe when I was like 20 or so. You know, I'm 43. I was born in 81. And so I'm sort of in that like sort of perfect range where, I adopted the internet early enough that I'm not like your grandma who's like trying to figure out Facebook to like see my grandkids or whatever. Like, I get it. I'm totally competent in it and like fluent in it. But I lived enough of my life beforehand that like I remember what it was like before. And so kind of straddle that time period and to see the transition that's taken place, where you had like a situation where you had people like on this level of emotional resonance, like going through this nightly liturgy, weekly liturgy on the same rhythm every, you know, just coming into work the next day, like in a similar emotional state because of what they experienced the night before. And like, you know, and again, don't hear what I'm not saying. Like, I'm not saying like everybody, you know, last night the show had a happy ending. Everybody comes into work in a great mood. Some dude argued with his wife last night and he didn't care what the show was. I mean, obviously, you know, in the individual level, that's true. But in the aggregate, there were these rhythms that were being followed that people were all a part of and sucked up into. And when you're in like a group environment like that, where there are emotional you know, sort of waves that are being ridden by the group as a whole, man, like it's incredibly powerful, you know, in ways that are so subtle that like you do things that experientially are just a pure act of your own will, but really like it's the crowd acting through you, you know, and nobody will convince you of that. You know, you think you're just making a decision, but like sometimes when you look back on it, you realize it, right? I told this story in my Jim Jones series about how I remember this one time when I was a kid and my church youth group went to see Billy Graham thing, right? And it was at Arco Arena in San Francisco. It's where the Kings play. 15,000 people inside, and there must have been 25,000 people outside with like big giant jumbotrons and stuff. And I never seen anything like this. It's pretty crazy, right? And so we're like far away, you know, the nearest jumbotron is not really that big, but we're sitting there and like me and the other kids, I was like literally like 11 or something, right? And so we're goofing off and like there's like a few adults, but mostly it's the youth group. They're bringing us there. And so we're kind of goofing off in the back and the adults are being like, keep it down, you three or whatever. And, you know, there's this one, the girls group is there and they're like, there's this one that like kind of has a crush on me. And like, there's this sort of dynamic going on and, oh, you know, just all this kid stuff. Right. And we're just not really paying attention to the whole thing. You know, he's up there preaching and we're just sort of being kids. We're doing our thing. Well, then toward the end, they do the altar call. And they tell people, like, if, you know, this message you heard tonight, like, resonated with you in any way, if like you want to take this opportunity to like renew your relationship with Christ and, you know, even change your life, you know, the gospel tells us you can do that, like with a simple act of your own will. Just make the decision, come up here, you can do that. And people start going up. I mean, thousands and thousands of people are going up there, right? And the kids aren't talking like to each other anymore and cracking jokes. It's like a very solemn, you know, they got the music and stuff, and it's like very well engineered experience. But like, the people are going up there like with a full heart, you know, people who are carrying around a lot of regret or rage or whatever, and they're going up there because this is an opportunity for them to redeem that. And so it's very real, very emotional. And then like kids in my group, like they start getting up to go, right? And pretty soon, like get to this point where like there was this one kid, he was a couple of years older than me, who was kind of like the I guess you would say like the alpha kid in the group in a way, just because he was the oldest and the biggest, and kind of he'd been in his family were like, you know, deacons in the church and had been for like couple generations kind of thing. And so like he was sort of like a natural leader, you know, and he gets up. Everybody at first was kind of like looking at him like almost for permission to go. And he got up and like everybody started getting up to go with him. And I literally felt like something almost lifting me up to go. Like I felt my legs, like without even sort of, you know, like willing it, like almost getting up, like without any volition at all. And it to the point where it felt strange. And I was like, whoa, this is weird. And I'm not going to go just because I don't know what's going on here. Right. So I didn't go. And, like that, hey, pretty boy, yeah, we're very busy. I'm telling a very heartfelt story. And so, I don't go up. Everybody else goes up. And I know you've heard this one before. It's fine. And the girl that I'd like kind of been crushing on, like there was this whole thing going on with her friends talking to my friends and all that kind of stuff. Like she kind of looks back at me like, come on, like we're going, whatever. And I don't go. And so they all go up there, and all these kids who had been just goofing off and flirting with each other and just doing all the stupid kid stuff this whole time, they come back and like most of them are weeping. And they're like visibly different. Like you just in their faces, there's like a certain serenity, a certain calm, you know, just even though they're crying, like a certain just calm serenity to them. And when they came back, it was clear like immediately that that they had like had a bonding experience up there that I was not a part of, and that like they were like one group and I was just separate from that because they had this experience. And that girl that I was crushing on, like that was over. And it wasn't because she was like, you didn't go. It wasn't like that. It was just obviously over. You know, it was just obviously like sort of something that was pre-altar call. And so you think about that, like, and these are kids again, who didn't listen to any of the sermon, like the entire thing. And yet the pull of the crowd brought them up there. And I'm not even saying like, therefore it's illegitimate or bad. Like they had an important experience up there, you know, and, you know, we're hyper-social mammals, that the call of the crowd is important to us for a reason. You know, it's built into us very deeply. It can be manipulated and like obviously put to very negative uses, but it's a part of who we are. And so, you know, you have, again, these kids who are like there in the most superficial way possible. A lot of them just got dragged there, sent there by their parents or something. And yet they have this incredible emotional experience that really like, I mean, it literally, it changed the way they behaved toward each other and toward other people. You know, they were, cause you know, it's like anybody who's been in a youth group, like as a kid knows, it's like being in school. You know, it can be a Christian school, but there's still bullies, there's still mean girls, there's all that kind of stuff. It's just like any other place. And like, and the kids who had this experience, like they were nicer to the other kids. They were changed. Now, a couple weeks went by and they kind of reverted back because, you have to reinforce that all the time if you're going to keep that kind of change going. So they kind of reverted back, but it affected their behavior. And if it had been reinforced on a regular basis, it would have changed them and kept them on that track. And so you look at that and say, like, what an unbelievably powerful experience it is. And again, to bring it, it's like a long anecdote, but like to bring it back to what we were talking about, it's like the age of mass media, where you have like people who are sort of put on this, on the same emotional wavelength night after night, week after week, year after year. And you're able to do that with a whole society. And that experience, just like Billy Graham's producers and event organizers were able to do with the music and the whole like presentation of it, which was very important to the experience, with this, with the mass media experience that people that dream world that people were in, it's also a very limited number of people who are engineering that whole experience to achieve like specific outcomes, like specific emotional outcomes, but then specific ideological outcomes and so forth. And, it naturally reflected the outlook and biases of those people. Today, the internet came along. Nobody really, you can really tell that like even the people at the top levels, they didn't really expect this to happen. They didn't expect the internet to turn into what it is, just because the reason that is that when you go back and look now at like, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or the JFK, assassin, any of the things, you realize like they didn't bother covering anything up, because they just had control of like the 3 channels and, the New York Times, and they just didn't really care. So sloppy. Now that we can just like look at everything on the internet, we're like, oh my gosh, like this is all right out in the open. And that's what tells you they didn't expect this to happen. They didn't expect to lose control of the information ecosystem like that. But what that's doing is all these people who were locked into this emotional resonance are now kind of scattering apart into like the very idea. I don't care if it's a Super Bowl or whatever, the very idea of 2/3 of the country coming together at the same time to watch something at night. It's inconceivable now. We're all, Tucker Carlson was the highest rated primetime news show, and it was like 3 or 4 million viewers a night, 1% of the American population. And like, some of those are bars, public places like doctor's offices and stuff. And so like massive audience in today's context, you go back to Walter Cronkite, that would have been like 30 million people, which is, again, we don't have anything like that. And so people have kind of siloed off and split off into their, into their little clubs with people who, when the information ecosystem becomes, really something that instead of helping explain things to people, really just confuses them, whether that's just because it's changing very rapidly or because it's polluted by propaganda and misinformation, or just because it's, because it's being weaponized by some, but whatever the reason is, what people do in a situation like that, where they don't know who's telling them the truth, is they do the most natural thing in the world. They do the thing I do, which is, well, I can look at this and say, I don't know what the truth is on this. Like, really, this is a television show to me. I'm watching the primetime news channels, but all that means it's just a television show. It could literally all be fiction for all I know. Like, it could be complete fiction. If you were watching MSNBC, Rachel Maddow during the Russiagate thing, you're literally watching a fictional conspiracy show. Like, that's what you're watching. And I'm sure there's things like that, like on Fox News right. And so you can look at that and say, this could be totally made up. But what I know is that Tucker Carlson doesn't hate my guts. And this woman over here on MSNBC really hates my guts. And so I'm going to trust this guy and get into this, into this lane and believe what he says. And that kind of tribalizes us. A corrupted or confusing information ecosystem forces us to tribalize. And it sort of really brings out that friend-enemy distinction and brings it to the forefront, in a lot of ways, because that's the first thing you have to figure out is like, who is a threat to me and who's not, who is like trying to hurt me and who's not. And, you know, in a healthy society, in a healthy democratic society, the society that we were in, you know, 1950 or something, people were not thinking that way. You know, most people were not thinking in terms of like, you know, what are the factions in power that are trying to destroy me and my way of life, and who can I trust? Like, and it just, we were able, you know, our sense of community in the country, again, I think to a large extent because of the mass media environment that was in place at the time. Because by 1950, maybe 1950, I mean, by 1950, I think it was like, I think there were about 50 million households had televisions, which was still only like 60 or 70% or something. But by the time you get to 1960, it's literally like the cell phone. It's like 98% of houses. And the average like TV watch time in an average American household is literally like 6 hours a day, right? And I'm sure that's like mom watching a soap opera during the day, dad watching the news, and the kids watching cartoons. But still, that thing is a dominant force in that household, you know, in terms of just setting the tone for the day and everything. And like, and everybody else is doing it too. Your neighbors are doing it. The next town over is doing it. Everybody in the next state's doing it. And so that, you know, that sort of unifying information ecosystem sort of put people into a place where they could go one step beyond the friend-enemy distinction and, you know, think about politics on like, you know, one level beyond, where we can, you know, think about, and you know, people can look back and say, well, those people only thought they were doing politics, you know, the strings were being pulled at another level.
Sure.
That's not even what I'm talking about. Like what actual influence and impact they're having on policy. That's not even what I mean. I'm talking about interpersonal politics, practical politics, how you feel about your neighbor, your countrymen, you know, that's what I mean. And people were able to step back and, you know, deal with disagreements over tax policy or something.
Well, this goes back to, I think, something you said at the beginning of the conversation, but we were also talking about it at lunch, which is, there used to be all these organic structures that people in the 50s, even if they were at the tail end of a society that had these kinds of organic structures like family and your neighbors, community. There he goes. Like they still existed. And so even if you have sort of a unifying force at the top, you're not confused as much by that box, by that glowing box that screams at you.
Yeah. Oh, dude,
because
such an important
because you know your dad, because you know your grandpa, because your neighbor knew your grandpa, and all your grandpa, their grandpa and your grandpa grew up together in the same town. They all went to the same church. It's just now their pastor, the pastor's son, is now your pastor. Yeah. You know, all that exists. Fast forward to, again, we talked about this at lunch, the extreme example that comes out when all those dissolve is the Tim Walz is my dad or daddy, which was even more disturbing, types of tweets we saw last week. There's almost, people still need those structures. Obviously, that's how we're built by God, but those, they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, dude. There's 2 points there, and I'm going to state them both up front because they're both important. I don't want to forget one. The first has to do with just how much more difficult it is to propagandize people who are rooted in a community. So don't let me forget that. And the second part is we're talking about people calling Tim Walz daddy, and thinking about like how you know, like if you look at the Jonestown cult or any of the cults of the 70s or late 60s, like they were all made up of a bunch of people who were alienated from their families. Oh, of course. Because of course, like if you're not alienated from your family, like what are you doing?
How can you get people to move literally from the US all the way to South America?
Right.
It means they don't have a dad that tells them, you're not going. Snap out of it. You're come move into our basement.
And so, but the first part, I mean, if you think about like any good, you know, like military prison camp brainwashing expert knows that you gotta get people isolated before anything is going to really work on them, you know? And if you get people isolated long enough, you can get just about anything to work on. You know, you can implant ideas like pretty deeply into somebody if you do it right. And like the thing is, like, I mean, if you think about how we usually use the term we're talking about, like the news media or something. Media is just, you know, in terms of like in its real definitional sense, right? Just a message being sent from a sender to a receiver and being understood on the other end, right? So sender, receiver, and means of interpretation, right? So speech is a form of media. And so if you go back to like any hunter-gatherer society, or even like a medieval village, or even like villages out in the countryside in most of Europe in like the 1600s, which is still most people at that point. The people who, like, all the information that those people got, because most of them were not literate, it would be very strange and rare if you were not a priest and you were literate in an English village in 1500. All the information you got was literally given to you face to face. Like that was literally how it was. All information was given to you. Like it was, there's no recording devices. You can't read. There's no, I mean,
yeah.
Every piece of information you have is delivered to you. And it might be like delivered to you in a crowd and there's a guy up on the podium, but it's by a human being that you're looking at. And so if you think about like reading the Bible, well, nobody, you know, none of these people in 1500 read the Bible. The Bible, every single time they'd ever heard the Bible or, you know, just ever were delivered the message of the Bible, it was being read to them by a man who's in a position of great authority and respect in the community, who's on an elevated like position most of the time in like traditional vestments in an environment that is like built and specially suited to sort of like lend authority and reverence to what's going on. That is, every single time you've ever heard the Bible, that's how you got it, right? And like you can expand that out to like people's whole experience of just information exchange, right? It's all done face to face. And what that means is you're always getting information from somebody that you have like a human relationship with in one form or another. And so if this is like, if I'm a kid and my grandfather is telling me this, that's going to be very different than like if I'm an old guy and my grandkid is telling me this, or if a stranger is telling me this. And, you know, if a stranger comes and tells me something and my dad and my grandfather tell me, no, that's not true. And those men have authority in our lives because this is a traditional society and I'm an English peasant or whatever. They don't have to explain themselves. You know, that stranger, he's just going to be filtered out because he's trying to invade an existing like authority structure that just has no room for like people coming in and injecting things that the structure objects to, you know? I mean, and so there's like a great deal of immunity to propaganda. In fact, Jacques Ellul in his book, Propaganda, he has a whole chapter about this. It's one of the best chapters of like any of his books, but it's one of my favorite chapters, period, where he talks about how in order to propagandize people, like in order to use propaganda effectively, the first thing you have to do is you have to get them alone, which, you know, we can't put everybody in their own little cell here or whatever. But in a social context, that means you have to like, you know, get people out of their traditional environment where
get them on their phone.
You get them on their phone. Yep. And like, and, you know, in his day, he was writing this in the 60s. He meant like, he's looking and saying like, you look at the urban environments that we have where it's this very strange, like, thing that appears as a paradox at first where like you know, everybody is anonymous, everybody is disconnected individual who is like everybody that they sort of meet usually throughout the day is equally anonymous. They have no like, you know, unless it's their boss at work or something, they don't have like a real status relationship to them that really means something, you know, even if it is their parent, it's like not the same as like, you know, in a traditional tribe, that's my father, you know, it's like everything is sort of just a nominal relationship that could shift at any moment. And you have to get people in an environment like that. Well, right. So he says, you know, you have this weird paradox where people are like very isolated like that. And yet at the same time, you have the formation of this thing called the public mind, where, you know, you can have mobs that have millions of people in them in a way, like people like behaving with a mob mentality. And it's like entire regions of the country behaving this way, right? And
it's a perfect storm of like disconnected,
yes,
unmoored people, all connected on the other end,
right,
centralized like media apparatus.
Yes, yeah, and it's, you know, you get people in an unstructured state. That's really what it is. Is you get a mass of people in an unstructured state. If they're in a state where every one of them is firmly socketed into a family that has hierarchies within it, and they're firmly socketed into a community that knows them, and they're known, socketed into like a guild, you know, or some sort of vocational group that really means something. Just all these, a church, obviously, all these different things that they're socketed into, that kind of give shape to their being, at least their social being. Then, you know, you're going to have an extremely difficult time selling that person something that is not natural to them, right? And so yeah, Lul talks about this. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, yeah, talking about like any of these cults. There's and, you know, obviously it's related to the same dynamic. Is it like,
the whole Tim Walt's my dad.
They're all made up of people who, you know, I was talking to Jocko about this actually a couple weeks ago. How, you know, if you go back and watch that movie Rebel Without a Cause, right? Everybody has the what's the kid's name again?
James Dean.
Every single time I talk about this movie, I forget his name. It's like, yeah. Anyway, everybody, like, I noticed today, because most people haven't seen that movie today, and if you ask people about it, they're like, oh yeah, didn't he die in a car crash at the end? And that's what people kind of think happened at the end. He died in a car crash, right? That's not what happened in the movie. If you've seen the movie, like, what happens, he's this rebel without a cause, but then at the end, he pulls back from the brink and reunites and reconciles with his family and sort of comes back home. And then the real James Dean died in a car crash, and those two things have kind of been merged together in the public mind. But what actually happened, this was like, I think 54 or something like that, I think it was that the rebel without a cause pulled back and went back to his family and reconciled with his father, and that was the happy ending. You go up to like the late 60s, in a lot of the big movies that you start to see pop up then, in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think of like Jocko and I were, at the time, we were talking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Right. And then I brought up like Easy Rider, bring up like Cool Hand Luke, which I think was like 67. All these people who were like social misfits, rebels without a cause, right? Who all have disastrous endings, you know. Paul Newman gets killed at the end by the prison guard. The two guys in Easy Rider get run off the road and killed by some good old boys. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you know, he gets a pillow over the face. They all have a bad ending at the end. And one of the things you notice is like, in all these movies, like, where are any of these people's families? It's like they don't have a family. For the purpose of the story, they have no family. Like, they don't mention them. They don't meet them for sure. They just don't exist. And so you have this individual who's out there, like, now that James Dean character doesn't have a family to go back to, or he's not willing to do it, you know, whatever it is, these people are alone in a way that they weren't before. And that is a cultural change that really did take place from like 54 to 1970, you know, and not just one that took place in like the collective mind or the culture, but it took place like in a real experiential sense, you know. Those 16 years, 15, 20 years that went by, you have a new generation of people that grew up very differently. You know, they grew up in the suburbs watching TV. They didn't grow up in the parish neighborhood. And all of those, you know, again, those rooted structures had lost their grip on a lot of those people.
As you were talking, I was thinking of, I was trying to remember the chapter, but the parable of the prodigal son.
You think about, like, as a society, we're almost like the prodigal son, you know, the story, parable Jesus tells about the son who asks his father for inheritance early and then blows it, hookers and
wastes it all, and then realizes I've sinned against heaven and my father, and I'm not worthy to be called his son, but I'm going to return. And he goes back and he's embraced, given the ring, fatted calf gets killed, all that stuff. Great story, great parable. As a society, we're in this interesting, this is what made me think about what you were talking. This is a society where like, it's like that story, but it's like a kid that gets inheritance from a distant like relative they never knew. And sure, they go on and blow it because we inherited Christendom again, sort of the remnants of it. But then we have no father to go back to. Like that part just kind of cannot happen.
Yeah.
Which is the most important part of the story. Is that the father, as he sees the son, it says that as the father saw his son from afar, it means he was like looking out for him. Even before the son arrives back home, the father runs out and embraces him. If you don't know, if you're on board, if like you don't literally know who your actual dad is, like, you're gonna call Tim Walz dad because that's the father hunger sort of at the heart of civilization that has no father to run back to. Yet we inherited it all, just like that kid. We just blew it, and now we're like, all right, we're with the pigs. Where do we go back home to?
Yeah,
there's no home.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to think about, but that's very true. Yeah, I mean, in the real like difficulty with it is like even the nature of fatherhood has changed, for most people in a way that like, even if you have an intact family that loves you and you can go back to visit or whatever, like it's still, the authority that allows you to draw strength from the father in a way that those things to a large extent have dissolved, and
even the sense of patria, again, coming from the Latin pater, which was the head of the household. And you think of even certainly your personal father, but your actual sort of your dad, but like even your homeland as a patria, that has no or waning authority depending on the country you come from, as a source of that kind of strength.
Well, it's something that, I mean, really like the big push of the 20th century, right? Of 20th century liberalism, I guess, has been, you think about like, it's really strange because I think like people at the time, like I don't think this was all planned out or anything, but it's just the consequences of how things have played out. That we took liberty to mean like freedom from constraint, and what are the things that like most constrain you on a daily basis? It's not the government usually, unless you're maybe even if you do live in the Soviet Union in 1960, it's still probably not the government. It's your parents, it's the teacher at school, it's the authority figures around you in your community. Like those are the people who are actually putting constraints on you on a regular, just sort of daily basis. And it became, we need to liberate people from all of those things. We need to, like, I got into a discussion with a buddy of mine. He was well-meaning. He's a liberal guy, but he was well-meaning. We're talking about like the changes in media and how, with social media and the internet out there now, it's like really sort of, it's allowed people to, like the realm of their life that's like their private life. And it's not really private to like, big tech, but like it's private from like your spouse or something, has been just, that realm of your life has been radically expanded, right? So like you might have had a private life before where like you had a diary or,
just conversations with your buddies at the pub.
Conversations with your buddies at the pub, et cetera. But that was kind of the extent of it. Now it's like people have like their whole, like a big chunk of their life, like in this place that's totally shut off from like all the people in their real life, right? So it's like a private world that they're inhabiting. And and he was saying like there's like a good side, I guess, to that. Like, he was saying this kind of in passing to get to another point. But he was like, so you have like somebody who lives like a gay kid who lives in a community or family that's like going to be just like very punitive and like unaccepting and so forth. And he can go and like, find people that like he can talk to about it, whatever. And I was like, I stopped him. I was like, whoa, it's negative. Like I 100% object to like every ounce of what you're saying right now. Like the idea that like start with the fact that you're talking about a child and you're talking about that child's sexual identity, right? Right there, that should be like a huge red flag of like, what do you even, what you're saying is that this child should be able to go into a place privately that his parents don't know about, that none of the people in his real life know about, and go work out his sexual identity with strangers apart from all the people who were like supposed to, you know, his caretaker. And so I was like, absolutely not. And if that means like, look, yeah, are there going to be like, they're going to be some gay kid in some place that like his parents just beat the hell out of him and disown him. Yeah, I guess. But like the other side of that is like, you know, you're going to have kids going online and getting groomed. I mean, that's really basically what you're talking about, even in the good story where he goes and does this, like, you know, that's really what you're talking about. And so it's like, you know, this is like, I mean, this is like it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the sense of, you know, you can like, if you think about like, go back days before the internet, right? And you're at an event and your wife sees like a guy she used to date in high school, and she goes over and they're having a conversation while you're over here. And you go up to her afterwards and say, oh, what were you guys talking about? Everybody present, including her, is going to recognize you have a right to ask that question, right? Everybody's going to expect her to answer it and answer it truthfully because that's a question that's totally legitimate. If your wife befriends her old high school sweetheart on Facebook and she's talking to him on Facebook on her phone, and you say, oh, I want to see your phone, see what you guys are talking about, that's going to be looked at as like a radical violation of her privacy.
Right, in the modern mind, that's like breaking into.
And people will be like, oh, you can't do that. Like, and so it's like really when you think about like, you know, the intimacy of the smartphone is really, and this is one thing that makes me a little nervous about Elon is that neural chip thing that he seems to be interested in. I mean, I'm sure there's good medical like reasons for it and so forth, but it makes me nervous. But like the intimacy of the smartphone, right? Where have you ever noticed how people will like, you know, it doesn't matter who it is. It's the most innocent thing in the world. Somebody will be looking at ESPN.com. And if you walk up, they'll kind of turn their phone away like a little bit. And they're just looking at ESPN or something, but it's just a natural thing to do. And the reason I think is because, you know, because of like the way you interface with it so closely up to your face and something you're holding in your hand, and it takes up most of your vision when you're using it, it becomes like, is that
biblical language would be in your bosom. Like it's right here, you know, it's that kind of intimacy.
Is that it blurs the boundaries between your own mind and thoughts and the digital space that you're in here. And it's like almost like, you know, it's like your mind is like half in your head and then half out here in this thing. And so like really that person's like kind of trying to look into your thoughts. And so you naturally kind of angle the phone away no matter what it is. And when you think about that, like, I mean, this is just this is like a very new world when it's just like like, I think it's actually probably pretty much normal now that like, you know, you go down a suburban street and find a married couple, and that probably both of them are friends on Facebook with like people they dated in the past or something. That's like, and I'm not saying that's necessarily like bad. Like I wouldn't, like, I don't think it's good. But I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but it's new, you know, it's a thing where like, that was just not something that,
especially if they're in different cities or geographies, like you lose contact with that person forever.
Right. And so like, you know, and so it introduces like even if it's innocent, like just having like, more and more of your life taking place in private, apart from the family environment or the community environment, it just drives a wedge and sort of delegitimizes the family or community situation in general. You know, when you think of, this is another thing I said to my buddy when he was talking about his example, you know, the gay kid finding friends or whatever. You know, I said that like, if you think about how like your own childhood, you know, it was once you hit puberty and you start getting like crushes on girls or whatever, like you start getting girlfriends and, getting into that, the sexualized period of your life, like that automatically sort of, it I wouldn't say it necessarily like brings down the authority of your parents like a peg or two. I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but I would say that like you're much more willing to challenge their authority. You're much more, because like this thing is super important to you. You're if it wasn't, then the species wouldn't have made it this far, right? So it's like this huge like compulsive thing that is sort of pounding your will to drive you in a certain direction. And if your parents are going to stand in the way of that, they don't like your girlfriend, well, too bad. You're going to like, whereas like if it was like just one of your buddies or something and your parents, parents might tell you, I don't want you hanging out with him. He's a bad influence. You might not like it, but it's not going to like, it's not the same as like, you have to break up with that girl because she's bad. Like kids aren't going to do that. And it's because like once you start to develop like a sexual identity, you're starting to become an adult now, and you're starting to have a life that, your parents are not in control of. Right. And so that's starting to develop. And so when we start going out and telling kids, all kids at this point, I mean, we're telling like 5-year-olds that literally like the mainstream media is telling 5-year-olds that, you at least need to be thinking about your sexual identity. You need to be starting to work this out for yourself. Like it just, it's taking that kid and again, get back to that idea of putting people in isolation. It's drawing them away. It's like any of the people around you who, that even if they are supportive, this is not theirs. This is entirely yours. This thing, they might be in favor of it. They might love all those kind of things. It doesn't matter. This is like, you're by yourself dealing with this, and everybody gets kind of pulled and broken apart. And we're doing this at like, basically as soon as kids can understand propaganda on TV or whatever, like as soon as they're capable of being influenced by it, we're pumping it into them,
I'm going to throw another biblical reference here. That's for some reason there's bouncing around my mind. I think you're pointing out something that on a natural scale, like just you see as early as Genesis 2, where therefore a man shall leave his wife or his father and mother and like join his wife, and two shall become one flesh. When a man finds a woman, he wants to leave his parents, but in that structure, obviously there's a natural way you do that. But yes, you find your sexual partner, those desires like point you in a direction that's away from your parents. You pursue this woman, you marry her. So that happens, and now you have the 5-year-old kids, which is essentially a very diabolical toward version of this, where it's like you leave your father and mother to cleave to something.
Yes.
Not necessarily a person. Mm-hmm. The natural way in which human beings are made by God, this is just sort of weaponized in a just awful way.
Yeah. And, I think because we've only been doing this for a pretty short period of time where it's been this extreme in getting kids started at like.
Well, I was told that like some Neanderthal was binary.
Yeah. I mean, look, maybe not, but it wasn't because there was like a Neanderthal like propaganda agency set up to like get them to think that way when they're 4 years old, like. And so we'll see how the consequences of this play out. But I mean, we've already seen, like when I like I have my views that are, pretty right-wing conservative when it comes to like all the sexual revolution stuff, whether it has to do with abortion or anything else. Like, but at the same time, like I look at a debate like that and as unsympathetic as a lot of the feminist pro-abortion types, can be, like in a visceral sense, like in a broader sense, like I look at them and I'm like, man, this is a very different and difficult world, right, that we've created here, where it used to be that like a girl turned 15 and she started her period and her family starts looking for a husband, and then she's married off by the time she's 17 and she's a mother now, and that's what's going on. Or at least it's like pretty young. The point is she's staying in her father's house until she's passed on to her husband. And now she's in that environment and she's a matron of her own home. And there's a smooth transition to that other phase of life. What we do now is we take it even 20 years ago. So forget about all the crazy stuff we're talking about now with 5-year-olds, but even 20 years ago, we tell a girl like, leave your father and mother when you're 17, 18 years old, let's say. When you get out of high school and like you go to college, say you leave your father and mother. And then there's just this sort of period, maybe 20 years, might be 20 years before you actually like get married finally and like really settle down. But like, it'll probably be 10 years. And so you have this period where you have a sexually mature female who is just out in the world for 10, 15, 20 years. And it's like, you know, I mean, think about like certain consequences of that, right? Like for one thing, you have a woman going through like some of the most formative years of her life, her 20s and 30s, you know, that period of like crunch time as she's thinking about reproduction. She's thinking about like, you know, just all the pressures of becoming like who she ought to be, you know, because that's not handed to her in the way that it is in a traditional society. Going through that whole period of her life without like the support structure of a family, first of all. And so, you know, you say, who are like those women going to vote for example? They're going to vote for people who are going to take care of them, you know, or promise to take care of them at least. And like, so you have like a consequence there. You have a consequence of like, okay, a woman gets married. She's 35 years old. She started dating when she was 15. She's been sexually active for most of that time. That means, you know, you're marrying a woman who basically by definition for the last 20 years, every relationship she's been in has ended badly. Because if they hadn't, then that guy would have been where you are right now, right? And so like they, you know, maybe like some of the breakups are more amiable than others or whatever, but they're all disappointments. They were all disappointments at least. And a lot of them were a lot worse than that, right? They were betrayals or just whatever. Like you got like 20 years of that now. And it's just this big space that's opened up because, you know, you sexualize somebody before you're going to transition them to a family environment and they're left out on their own. And, you know, we put out things like, I mean, look, it's like, again, like it's hard to sympathize with a lot of the activist types, you know, who are out there. But like when there's a girl out there who's in her early 20s or something, who is really just doing what everything she's been taught her whole life to sort of listen to is telling her to do, you know, she's going out, she's sleeping with people, like just living her life, you know, like Sex in the City or whatever. Like, even politicians will tell you that like, you know, it's perfectly virtuous, empowering way to live. Right. So she's just listening to her society, you know, living the way that she's being told is like a fulfilling path, you know, on her life. And her parents, you know, I mean, they didn't take her to church when she was a kid, or maybe they did on Christmas and Easter, but that was it. And, you know, they're split up anyway, you know, her mom and dad split up when she was 14. So like, you know, she has 2 step parents now and whatever. So it's not like she can look back at that and think that she's sort of, you know, yeah, she's listening to the society, but she's breaking away. She's not breaking away from anything, you know. She's just in this environment and doing what she thinks she's supposed to be doing. And then she's 23 or whatever, and she gets knocked up by some one night stand or whatever, and she wants to have an abortion. It's like, that's not hard for me to understand, you know, in terms of like how she would feel about that and just like not want this to happen. And, you know, I totally understand like how somebody would feel that way and why they'd be so passionate about it, you know, but it's one of those situations that just never would have existed in the past.
Yeah, the entire structures of society create the conditions where the logic oddly makes sense.
Yeah. And like we changed all those conditions, and yet people are sort of, you know, they sort of expect the old like mores and ways of looking at things just to hold up indefinitely, right? Like, you know, like you're not like people like, you know, put up a graph of like people who've had premarital sex, and like it used to be like 30% of people or something, and now it's like 98% of people or whatever it is. People are like, oh, this is just an example of like the moral decline of America and da-da-da. It's like, yeah, kind of. But it's also the fact that people used to get married when they were 20, and now you're asking them to abstain for 15 years. And that's just not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. Okay. And like, and if it does happen, that person's probably going to be like, you know, struggling in other ways, right? Where it's just like, and again, there's exceptions to that. And that would be if you are one of the lucky few who are actually in a strong family and community and church environment that you're a part of, like then, you know, people can lead that life and be healthy. But then, you know, most of those people are probably married when they're 20 anyway. So like, I mean, you think about like how, I mean, just the idea of marriage and how, you know, it's become like a thing that if you think about like in any traditional society, right? Marriage was like, you had two people who went to the sacred gathering place of their community, right? To the church that their entire community attended every Sunday. They went there, and the man who's like a natural leader in their community that people go to with their problems, that they trust, the priest, you know, the parish priest or whatever, the pastor, they go before that man and they make vows before God and everybody they know to make this union work. And you have her family over there and your family over here. And this is like a union of these two families. And it's important in that. So all of these things. I mean, this is something that bears tremendous weight. Okay. Now you take it where, you know, the family over there and the family over there, you see them maybe once a year for Christmas, both sides. You live in a different state, you know, because you both went off to college somewhere. The priest is like, if it's even a priest, is like, it's just a local, you know, whoever's closest or like just, you know, closest of the denomination one of you grew up with or something, but it's not like this, you know, community figure for most people. You just take all of those supports away and then say, you know, take this vow as seriously as it was always taken in the past. And then you're disappointed when that doesn't happen. And it's like that, you know, that's just not how it works. Like there's a reason, like there's some people who like when I've talked to people before about, I said what I said earlier about how, you know, the church building and the vestments and the priest being on an elevated platform and the incense and the music, that all this is like meant to like bring you up to like a certain emotional and psychological state where you're available to like receive certain messages and to take something like the Holy Communion seriously and really feel it, right? It's not like you can just walk in off the street into a storefront church and he says, hey, how you doing? Here's some bread and wine. Like, this is communion. Now you take that, and it's not how it works, right? You got to build up to that, and the whole environment's built for that. And there's some people that hear me say that and they think like, oh, you're saying it's like phony or it's somehow superficial. I'm like, no, I'm saying it like, this is human. This is how human beings work. You have to, you know, and that's all this stuff. Like if you're not in an environment that supports all the things, the values or whatever that you want to sustain, then, you know, the individual can do it in the breach, but in general, those things are going to fall apart over time.
I think it comes down to just how, like, we just had a professor of theology on the pod yesterday. I don't know if it'll release before this or after, but he was talking about Joe Rigney, at New St. Andrews College up down in Moscow, Idaho. And we had a great discussion about just what I would just summarize as the passionate age, like people just led by their passions. He specifically doesn't use the word emotion because he goes for something more ancient. And yeah, where the whole point is like, if it makes you feel like you got married, right? Or if it makes you feel like it's communion, it's communion. But like, it's an almost like bizarrely Gnostic approach to the world that forgets that no, bread is real bread, and like a church is a church, and the organ sounds in a unique way that's different from a guitar and smoke machines or whatever, you know, like the vows that you take, if you write them versus if they're the vows that the same Christian people have taken for hundreds of years, it matters. Like that's the world, that reality is organized in such a way that it really matters. Not just how you feel, but like what so we'll call them the accidents of reality that you're interacting with, the levers and the buttons that you push on a daily basis, like what those are.
Yeah.
And now it's just like, well, if it makes you feel like you did the thing.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, people live their lives individually, collectively. You know, nations govern themselves politically, like just at every level. We lead our lives like by bursts of emotion and sort of in momentary enthusiasm. Like that's just the only thing that we can really think of to like, you know, motivate us toward any kind of like concerted action. And obviously that's not something that's sustainable. And so we're all over the place. You know, the very idea, like you said, like marriage is something that it's crazy for Americans or just Western people in general to think today. They're like throughout pretty much all of history, marriages were arranged, and you know that didn't necessarily mean you were marrying somebody you never met before, didn't want. You know, there's a lot of, you know, family politics that go on. You probably have a say in it more than you know, it gets presented sometimes, but still, you know, your families are arranging this, and two people very often like are married, and you know, whereas like in the modern model, yeah, the honeymoon, that's like the high point of your like marital emotion toward each other. And then from there, it's just sort of like a slow decline down to normal, because this is like your person, your spouse that you've been with for a long time, live with. And
literally the formula of like their rom-com is the serendipitous meeting in New York at the coffee shop.
Yeah.
And it ends with, you know, whatever the winding path is. It ends with maybe the wedding ceremony. The end.
Yeah, yeah, and people are
like
told,
randomness ends with this weird ceremony.
Yeah,
period.
And people are told that like that feeling should be sustained, and it's the responsibility of the two people to make sure that it's sustained for the other person. And if that feeling isn't sustained, then that means that the other person is not doing their job in this relationship, and I'm at liberty to break my vow. You know, that's like that's really like how people look at it, and like, you know. I think like I wouldn't say that like I want us to go back to, you know, arranged marriages. I think romantic love is something that's been like a profound creative force in the West, you know, going back 1,000 years. But you know, it's like I think a much more like lasting type of love. And you see this a lot of times even with like older folks, like our grandparents' generation and before them. Like if you talk to them about it, like what you find a lot of times is they got married, and it was like not like a marriage of convenience, but like, you know, you got to get married, and so they get married, and they grew to love each other over time, you know, by sharing each other's burdens and by watching the other person step up when they were weak, and you know, by just that mutual exchange, you know, and sharing a responsibility that goes with raising a family and holding up a household. You over time gain a certain amount of like love that is much more, you know, it's borders on profound respect more than like the sort of meet at the coffee shop kind of burst of enthusiasm kind of love that we think of. But it's something that, in a lot of ways, I would say in every way, it's like much, much deeper, and it's much more solid, you know? But again, it's one of those things that you have to start out with like a certain idea of what you're getting into and what the terms of the relationship are. Otherwise, your expectations are going to warp the whole experience going forward, you know?
Well, the contemporary system just strips out all the context too, where if you married someone from where you grew up, at the very least, you have boxes for the types of people who were there, or your dad worked at this company. Even closer, maybe you say, I know your brother, I know your mom, like I have all this background where I know you're not an insane person.
Yeah.
Versus if you rip someone and they just go to college and you have your college girlfriend, man, they just drop out of the sky. Yeah. You have no context for anything. Yeah. It's just like in risk levels just off the chart compared to like a regional meeting.
And especially like, and that's if you get married straight out of college. Like if you get married when
that's the best case scenario.
When you're 35 and she's 35, like that's, I mean, these days, just because it's so, you know, economically prohibitive to start a family, like for a lot of people, like that's what we're seeing, like millennial generation just pushing it later and later for totally understandable reasons in a lot of ways. Like when individual people are making their life decisions, you get up to that point and it's like, now, not only does she drop out of the sky, like you are, you know, guy number X, several of like whom, like the previous ones have like cruelly betrayed her, have like, you know, corrupted her ability to like really sort of let go and trust a male, you know, because like she's been cheated on, or she's just whatever it is, like, you know, that she's been through these experiences that like, you know, it again, this is just the world we live in. There's no sense of like pining for the 1950s or whatever, but these are like real challenges people have to deal with, you know, and it's not about like, you know, idiots on Twitter talking about like body count or something. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with like, what are her preconceptions going into this relationship? What are the limitations on the trust that she can give you and feel safe because of her experiences in the past? All those things are radically changed by all this, you know? And again, like to go back, what started this kind of detour, I mean, for God's sake, like we're sexualizing kids now, like in elementary school, like not sort of in a sense of like, you know, we're looking the other way when Johnny wants to give Sally a Valentine card or whatever and kind of like smiling. No. We're like the institutions that we have set up to educate and raise these kids are actively sexualizing them. And so we're pushing that, you know, we're pushing that envelope back all the way as far as it can go, basically. And, you know, I think that like, talk about like, you know, when we talk about England earlier and the European countries that are losing their ancient homelands, and how, you know, there are certain things that I think that at a certain point you just have to say no more. And this stuff, and I think that this topic is one where people do feel that way. I think we're still in process of figuring out exactly what to do about it, you know, because that's the thing that the right always struggles with. You know, the right, like right-wing politics for the last decade or two, at least, has basically been us trying to like basically begging the other side, please give us another way to address our concerns without imprisoning all of you or stringing you up from lampposts. Give us any other way, because we don't want to do that. Like, we value the Constitution. We don't want to like radically destroy the country that like we grew up in. All those things are important to us. We don't want to give all those things up. Just give us something, throw us some kind of a compromise that we can work with to feel like that, you know, that's not our only option. Like, that's been like right-wing politics for like 20 years. And like, it's kind of getting to I mean, it'd be very interesting to go back to like around, like, I can't remember, it's been a long conversation that's kind of melded with our lunch conversation now, but like, you know, you talk about like the MAGA Trump movement. You know, it really does like kind of feel like it's the last off ramp, you know? It's like, like,
you talked about diffusion. Like, maybe one of the functional roles of Trump would be diffusing.
Yeah, well, there's that. But what I mean is like, you know, in that sense of like, give us any other way other than just breaking our constitutional system or maybe resorting to violence to stop this, because you're now pushing us to our limit. You know, when you are using state-run schools to sexualize our 5-year-olds, when you are taking, you know, in Minnesota, you're taking kids away from their parents for not allowing them to transition when they're children. Like, this is like, we're not going any further than this. Like, and we're not tolerating what's already here. Like, this has got to change, or we can't live together anymore. That's where I think a lot of people are at. And, you know, and I feel like, and again, I don't think Trump cares about this stuff that much. That's not the point. The point is the people who do care about it are united in a political coalition that happens to be led by Trump right now. And that movement is sort of the last off ramp, in the sense of like, of those people being like, you know, like, we're trying to deal with this politically and in an orderly manner. You know, we're trying to do this the way that it's supposed to be done, the way we were always taught that it was supposed to. We're trying to. And so when they see what happens with, you know, whether it's all of the lawfare that goes on, when they see just the administrative state mobilizing against this guy and the whole movement just in really unprecedented, you know, ways that it's been weaponized against, not just, you know, Richard Nixon, say, but like a lot of the general public, you know, Ricky Vaughn's still in jail. I think he's still in jail, right? Yeah. I mean, it's just totally insane from like, you know, if you think about it, it's not like, you know, Eugene Debs being put in jail by Woodrow Wilson during World War I, which was bad enough. But, you know, at least you could say this is like a, you know, a prominent, you know, socialist who's like out there trying to, you know, demoralize people in time of war or whatever. But this is like regular people, like is where we're at. So you got the lawfare, you got that stuff. You have like literally like in broad daylight, like intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies, like, you know, being weaponized against this political movement. It's all, and then you get to the election and, you know, things went the way they went in 2020 and we'll see how they go in 2024. That, you know, I think we're at that last point where, now this doesn't mean, and this is where Charles and I sometimes disagree, is like, that doesn't mean then that, like, let's say they just, you know, Trump's way ahead in this upcoming election. And then, you know, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all announce at midnight that they're shutting down for the night. And you wake up in the morning and they're way ahead and like, no, but you know, the explanations that are given don't make any sense. And the people who like, you know, who question, you know, the explanations that are given if they're not on X or getting banned from all those things, right? Let's just say all that happens again. Then I think like a lot of those people are, I think most of those people are going to be done with all this. They're going to look at it and say, there's no political solution. Now, Charles will say, yes, exactly. And then the next step is Red Caesar or whatever.
Spicy times, I think.
Yeah. And it's like, maybe. Also, though, it may be that people just get profoundly demoralized and sort of withdraw from, you know, the political game and like try to keep their heads down and, you know, duck and hide from this regime that like at the end of the day, you know, it's not like actively going out hunting for people who aren't opposed to it. You know, it's actively hunting dissidents and people who are opposed to it, but like you can stay off its radar for the most part, unless, you know, you have a kid that gets told by his teacher he's trans and you don't want to give him puberty blockers, then you're on the menu. But like, you know, that could happen. I think like, you know, in the absence of the social capital that would really be required to like this is like the real service that Trump has provided. Forget everything else. I don't care about any of the policies. I don't really even care, like, you know, the fact that like the Overton window on many issues is moved, like all that stuff is fine. Like it's fine and it's good. But what it's really done is it's brought all these people who had no reason to come together before. It's brought them together and it's caused them to look to the left and look to the right and realize like, oh, okay, these are my people. I kind of see what they look like, you know, in a social sense, like see like who these people are, who are my people. And, it at least opens up the possibility that those people can organize in the future, you know. Now, the danger you run into with any populist movement, and this is, you know, this is what makes me think that like on one hand, I think that there's just no way they would try to pull any shenanigans again with the election. Like they don't have COVID to take advantage of. They don't, you know, several of the states that had these crazy ballot harvesting, you know, mail-in ballot things going on have changed the rules, so you can't do that. I don't like, and plus everybody's watching now. Like everybody's watching like a hawk, and like
Twitter's now open.
And Twitter's open. So I'm like on one hand, and last time, like, you know, yeah, sure, like people have overplayed it like crazy. But on January 6th, Nancy Pelosi was hiding under her desk, like hoping that those people didn't come to that door. Like that's where that led last time. And as much as it's been overplayed and everything, she was hiding under her desk. You know, and so were the rest of those people. And they saw how close it got, at least in their own paranoid fantasies, right? And so they know that, like, if we push this again in broad daylight, when people are expecting it, when it'll have to be much more blatant because we can't, you know, say there's COVID and we need to just mail in ballots for infinite time, whatever, the consequences could be really, really bad. And it just might not be worth it. Like we contained Trump for 4 years before, we'll figure out how to do it again, and then we'll move on. Like that makes me think maybe they'll just let it go.
Write it off. Yeah.
On the other hand, if they let Trump become president again, you have 4 more years of these people, the movement, coming together, these people getting used to each other, organizing, building up their own like internal structures to sustain this challenge over time, to develop new leaders, maybe JD Vance, maybe other people step up, but like other people who are going to pick that up. And they look at that and they say, you know, like right now, these people are real enthusiastic. There's a ton of them, but really they're a bunch of people who are loyal to Donald Trump. They're not loyal to any of these other people. There's nobody else out there, maybe with the possible exception of Tucker Carlson, that could grab all these people and get them moving again. Like there's just nobody else out there with just the personality and the cultural position to be able to do that. And so if we can take this guy out just one more time, whatever the consequences, we'll deal with them, then we can be done with this thing for good. Because those people they're not going to follow some, you know, in 2028 when JD Vance comes and says, I'm taking up the mantle. It's like, he hasn't had enough time in the public eye to build that up. There's nobody like
to off ramp from Trump to.
Yeah. And so they might just decide that it's worth the risk. You know, it's possible that they do that. If I was advising them, I would say, just let it happen, you know, get them focused on, I don't know, some trade deal that you all really know needs to be reworked anyway. And you can resist them on it and like, you know, pretend like you're whatever, but like you contain them once, you can do it again. But you never know, because I mean, for these people, like it really is like an existential fight. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we should downplay either. Like as much as, you know, when we see like the January 6th commission and all that, and we think these people are just political animals who are just cynically weaponizing this, you know, this very minor riot in the context of 2020, you know, probably the most minor riot that took place in 2020. Yeah. Like that they're just cynically like weaponizing this. It's like, maybe I think that is true for sure to a degree, but I also wouldn't underestimate like, you know, the feeling that these people had hiding under their desks in Congress, like the humiliation of it, the feeling of like, who do these people think they are, you know, and feeling like they need to overcompensate because of the humiliation they felt at being made to cower like that. And so I think there's a lot of real emotion behind it, but also a real sense for a lot of these people that this is kind of an existential fight for them. Not that they're going to get strung up from lampposts or something, but that they've turned it into that, you know, where everything we've built, everything that we've done, whatever it is going to be, you know, destroyed if such and such. And so, you know, that might take the brakes off what they're willing to do.
We've been going for a while, but I did want to ask you this question, kind of probably to wrap it all up. We've talked about even just ending right now with ruling class. We talked about elites, even marriages, people, kids. It's been awesome.
And that was all just when you asked me about Russia.
Exactly. You're having a good time. But as you read history, you've read an insane amount of history, and particularly focusing on your podcast episodes, on unique episodes across time. What constants, if any, have you seen like across elites in history that you think inform you how you think today? What constants do you see for how crowds behave? What constant, you know, whether it's the Aztecs dealing with the Spanish or Jonestown, are there any that come to mind?
Yes, but so I'm going to go like Spenglerian here. Right?
Sure.
Like a civilization or a society has a life course. You know, it's born, it starts to mature and express like the cultural character that, you know, is inherent in it. It grows to maturity, and then it begins to stultify and decline and eventually goes away, or at least just becomes a static thing, right? And so if you look at, if you were to say like, you know, is ancient Rome like the United States, right? You'd say, well, if you're looking at Rome in 400 BC, no, it's nothing like the United States. You get up to the part of, you know, Rome that kind of correlates with where we're at on our trajectory, and you start to notice a lot of similarities, right? And so you look at, when you talk about elites for the past couple hundred years in the West has, you know, that's meant something very different than it meant in even the late medieval period, right? Where, where a king was like literally expected not just to fight in battle, but to ride with the vanguard into battle. Like that's why he's king, is because he is willing to do that. And if he's not willing to do that, it's not going to be a king for very long, right? That's a totally different, obviously, right? It's a totally different sensibility of leadership and who the elites are and how they relate to their people compared to somebody who either rose through a bureaucracy or, even when
it's just ceremonial.
Yeah, right. It's much more of a, much more abstract and much more dependent just on the ceremony and the office of it to give them the aura of authority, right? Instead of just being, think about, if you go all the way back, right? Go back before you think about like state formation in general, like way back, right? And you're like this is like a pre-modern Neolithic or, something, and you're a farmer and, people starve to death in this world. Like that happens. You have a bad harvest, you starve to death sometimes, right? And you have your family, you have your farm, and there's a bunch of lions that keep coming and they're killing all your livestock. And that means your children are going to starve if this doesn't stop. But you're just this dude who has like a staff and maybe like a dagger or something, right? And there's a pack of lions. And a bunch of bad dudes show up on horseback and say, "Where are the lions?" You say, "Over there." And they go kill those lions. You're going to look at those guys and say, "That's the king." All right, roger that. Like, no problem. Like that is as natural a form of leadership as you can imagine, and now that guy might, come and oppress you tomorrow or whatever and, cause you to question his, but still, like that is an organic leadership structure if there ever was, right? And so you go all the way up to a point where, where really it's just a matter of like, the person, the leadership class is deriving its authority just entirely from the office itself. And, via their ability to control a machine that they can use against you if you challenge them, it gives you a leadership class that not only different in character because they're, they got there a different way, but different in character because, they themselves, recognize their own lack of legitimacy. They recognize it as much as anybody else. Now, these are the type of people, usually the people who put forth the effort, to get into a position like that, who that recognition is subconscious, and so they overcompensate for it in other ways. But one of the things that, you've seen, and again, this is like cross-cultural, and it really is is when you get to a certain stage in society's development where you have an elite structure that is, not like hereditary, but it's the forms and processes that elevate people to that level are sort of set in stone, and people rise up through these predictable ways, is that the leadership class starts to get like real weird and deviant. And it's happened again. This is not only cross like national boundaries like other places in Europe, it's cross-cultural. It's like you have the regular people out in the countryside or in the towns who are families and living their lives and so forth. And you have the elites who are up there in a place of real power who feel somewhat illegitimate in that position and need to prove to themselves like how powerful they are or how above everybody else they are. And a lot of the time, the way they do that, and you've seen this again and again, is through their willingness and ability to break moral standards that the rest of the society holds dear. And because then that you think about it, like, to look at like an Epstein situation or something. It's just, there was a French author, novelist, I can't remember his name now. But he got put in jail maybe like 7 or 8 years ago for pedophilia. And all of his books were novels about pedophilia. Literally one of his books was called like Under 16 Years Old. Like that was the name of the book. And it's just a pornographic novel, apparently, and that's what all his books are about. And it was one of those things like Epstein where everybody knew that this guy was a pedophile and like nothing happened. But then one day, like for whatever reason, you know, whether it was a noble cop or maybe he, you know, looked up the wrong girl's skirt or whatever it was, they decided to snatch this guy up and he goes to prison. And so the New York Times they were writing about this. And the title of the article, the news article, was like, a French novelist is on trial and so are French elites, something like that, right? And they're quoting this guy. They interviewed this novelist. And basically what he's saying, he's like genuinely outraged that this is happening. And the reason for that is not because he didn't do these things, but he's basically saying like, I can name you 100 people right now on up to the president of this country or whatever that I've watched them do this stuff. You know, I could start doing that. You want me to do that? And like, that's the attitude he really had. And like, from his standpoint, I can kind of understand the attitude, like just from, you know, that, you know, very specific, like a way of looking at it. And there was this one part in the New York Times article where it said, and I'm going to, you know, not get the quote exactly right. It's been a long time since I read it, but the idea of it's really stuck with me. Is it said, you know, that people had overlooked what he was doing for a long time, partly because of, you know, his connection to certain powerful people and so forth, and his position in like French culture, you know, but also because for several centuries, it has been like a mark among French elites to sort of differentiate their status by living according to a different code of morality than the rest of the public. And, you know, the French are probably a little more hardcore than a lot of people, but that exists everywhere, you know? And, you know, what does that do? You think about like, it creates this double illegitimacy, right? Where they already kind of know that they're just in power and have all this authority and power, even though that, you know, especially like when, you know, our systems that we have in place for like selecting and promoting leaders are so broken that like you're getting people up there who are really just common people, you know, like who are not remarkable, you know. It's, I think, why a lot of the guys in tech and stuff were finally starting to wake up. And so they're just looking at these people and they're like, these people are running the empire. This is crazy. These people are not smart. They're really sycophantic narcissists who are very good at, you know, certain types of intersocial, you know, games and stuff. But like, so you're selecting basically like people who are not remarkable, putting them in positions of ultimate authority, in charge of just, you know, with their hands at the controls of vastly powerful systems and power over the lives of so many people. And they kind of know that they're imposters. And so that's something that they have to compensate for. But then when one of the ways that they do that is by living, you know, again, according to a different code of morality, it places them in a situation where, you know, like for one thing, it binds them together a little bit, because it's like, you know, if these people knew what we were really about, they would kill us all. And like, you know, it puts them in a situation where it doubles their illegitimacy in a way, you know? And
so, you know, they're phony elites that are morally corrupt.
Yeah. And even if they don't look at it as morally corrupt necessarily, they know that everybody else does. The people they're ruling and have power over.
There used to be one reason I'm not like these people. Now there are two reasons.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, I think we've gone a long ways toward, you know, normalizing just about any behavior that could be considered morally corrupt anymore, other than not wanting to have your ancient homeland taken from you by people from South Asia. Everything else has pretty much been normalized as perfectly moral behavior. But not among the regular people. It hasn't. You know, look, I don't want to overplay that either. You know, Heartland America is deeply corrupted, just like everybody else. It has been impossible to avoid over the last several decades. But there's still like there's still a seed in there that could regrow into something virtuous, you know, among regular people. And you see it, and you see it in their reactions to, you know, the, like, again, the stuff that, like, the sexualization of children has really been one of those things. It's like I know, I take heart in this. We may be finished with this. Like, I take heart in the fact, there's this couple that I know very well. We're good friends. They got married in my backyard, right? In my house. Really good friends, know their family, known them since before they were married, know their kids. But we moved like to different states and just sort of lost touch. We'd like say happy birthday every once in a while or something, but we just kind of like lost touch, right? We ended up back in the same place, and I hadn't seen them like face to face for like 10 years. And all the conversations that we had had in the interim were just like small talk online, like catching up kind of, but like, you know, how are the kids, that kind of stuff. And the wife, she was a photographer. And so my wife and I needed some wedding pictures taken before the wedding. And so she was doing that for us, and we started talking to her. Now these two, they were like, I mean, I wouldn't say like they were apolitical, just in the extreme. I mean, I would like just, you couldn't, it would have been like completely insane for them to say any political statement. Like he was in a band, she was a photographer, you know, they were just the best people, like the best people. But for them to like make a comment on the election coming up or on it just would have been, the record would have been like screeched to a stop. And you're like, huh? Like, that's just not something that ever would have come out of their mouth. When the wife was there with us, she couldn't get through the first 10 minutes of our visit before just going off about stuff that's going on at school with the kids, and like just all the things that like are, and like, there's a lot of people like that. And I was like, oh, wow. I was like, if they've radicalized these two, they've radicalized a lot of people that you thought before were like totally checked out, you know? And I've noticed that more and more and more, you know, as people have, you know, again, like, I think that a big part of why, because you think about like the way these cultural changes happen, right, is like you have a young generation, a big young generation, like the boomers or the millennials, big enough to sort of overwhelm the culture once they start to come of age. And, you know, kids are rebellious. Kids want to change things. They want to push envelopes and stuff. So in 1960s, they're doing it. But then like they turn like 25 and they get married and they move on and become yuppies and stuff. And then you're electing Ronald Reagan, right? Well, the millennials had that same thing going on, only their period before they actually settled down and started thinking about things like what the teachers are teaching our kids and stuff was like an extra 10 years, you know? It's like going into their 30s and like late 30s. And so it's like that, the whole period of like just rebellion and revolution, cultural change and everything has had like a lot more runway. But I think we're getting to the end of that runway, you know? We still have to deal with, you know, the childless cat ladies as Caesar Vance said, but, you know, there's still going to be a force that we have to deal with. But I think that, you know, sort of the last bit of those millennials are finally starting to get to that stage in their life where they're starting to think about things that usually turns people in a more conservative direction, if only like, you know, in their approach to things, you know, in their sensibilities. So
let's hope.
Yes. And so that means now is the time to attack.
Darryl, this has been awesome. Where should people go listen to you or read your stuff? I
mean, if people have not gotten their fill of listening to me in this conversation, that would be a surprise. But I've got a history podcast called Martyr Made, where if this happens to be your thing and you've enjoyed this show, then you can hear me talk for sometimes, depending on the episode, like 7 hours at a time. So it's called the Martyr Made podcast. I do another podcast with my friend Jocko Willink called The Unraveling, where we talk about usually more modern history and politics a little bit more. And if you really, really like me and you would like to help support the podcast, go to martyrmade.substack.com.
Great stuff. Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.